The Milgram Obedience Experiment. The Milgram Obedience Experiment was one of the most unsettling psychological studies ever conducted. It revealed the terrifying ease with which ordinary people could be pressured into harming others simply because an authority figure told them to. In 1961, Stanley Milgram, a Yale psychologist, wanted to understand why people followed orders, even when those orders were morally wrong. This was inspired by the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi officers repeatedly defended their actions by saying they were just following orders. Could it be that anyone, under the right circumstances, would obey instructions, even if it meant hurting an innocent person? To test this, Milgram recruited ordinary men from different walks of life: teachers, salesmen, blue-collar workers. They were told they would be participating in a learning experiment. The setup seemed simple. One person, the teacher, would administer memory tests to another person, the learner. If the learner answered incorrectly, the teacher would shock them with increasing voltage as punishment. But there was a cruel twist. The learner wasn't really being shocked. They were an actor. The real subject of the experiment was the teacher, the person administering the shocks. Milgram wanted to see how far someone would go when instructed by an authority figure in a white lab coat. At first, the shocks started low, 15 volts, 30 volts. But with each wrong answer, the experimenter instructed the teacher to increase the voltage. The machine had labeled switches ranging from slight shock to danger, severe shock, and finally, XXX. At 150 volts, the learner began screaming in pain, begging to be let out. At 200 volts, they pounded on the wall. At 300 volts, they went completely silent. Many participants hesitated, shaken and distressed, but when the experimenter told them, "The experiment requires that you continue," most did. The results were shocking. 65% of participants went all the way to 450 volts, a level labeled as potentially fatal. Even when the learner stopped responding, many continued simply because they were told to. This study shattered the illusion that only evil people commit horrific acts. It showed that under social pressure, even regular individuals could be pushed to obey orders that went against their conscience. Ethically, this study was deeply controversial. Many participants suffered emotional distress, some even having nervous breakdowns during the experiment. Critics argue that Milgram traumatized his subjects, making them confront the dark reality of human nature. But what Milgram uncovered was terrifyingly real. His research explained why soldiers carry out war crimes, why police officers follow unjust orders, and why people turn a blind eye to cruelty, not because they are inherently evil, but because defying authority feels harder than obeying it. The Stanford Prison Experiment. The Stanford Prison Experiment is one of the most disturbing psychological studies ever conducted. It exposed the corrupting power of authority and how quickly people could turn into oppressors. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo wanted to explore how roles influence behavior. Specifically, he wanted to know, what happens when you give people power over others? To find out, he created a mock prison in the basement of Stanford University. He recruited 24 college students, all mentally healthy, and randomly assigned them to be either guards or prisoners. The setup was supposed to be simple. The experiment would last 2 weeks. The guards were given authority but told not to physically harm prisoners. The prisoners were arrested in their own homes, blindfolded, and brought to the prison to create a realistic experience. What happened next was horrific. Within hours, the guards embraced their power. They forced prisoners to strip naked, verbally abused them, and made them do humiliating punishments like push-ups or cleaning toilets with their bare hands. By the second day, the prisoners revolted. The guards responded brutally. They fired extinguishers at them, isolated ringleaders, and used psychological tactics to break their spirits. By the third day, prisoners began breaking down. One had an emotional collapse and had to be removed from the study. Another went on a hunger strike, refusing to obey, and was locked in a dark closet while the guards encouraged other prisoners to mock him. By the 5th day, some prisoners accepted their roles so deeply that they obeyed without resistance, even when the study was supposed to be voluntary. They had forgotten it was an experiment. By the 6th day, Zimbardo shut it down. The guards had become sadistic. The prisoners had become helpless, and what was meant to be a controlled study had turned into a real-life nightmare. This experiment proved how quickly power corrupts. It showed that people don't need to be evil to become abusive. All they need is a system that gives them control and no accountability. The Stanford prison experiment shook the world. It revealed the dark truth behind prison abuse, police brutality, and even concentration camps. Ordinary people can commit unthinkable cruelty if their environment encourages it. But the study was highly unethical. The prisoners suffered real psychological harm, and the guards, many of whom were normal, decent people, left the study shocked at their own behavior. To this day, the experiment is a chilling reminder that power can transform anyone into a monster if left unchecked. The Little Albert Experiment. The Little Albert Experiment is one of the most infamous psychological studies in history. It demonstrated how fear could be artificially created through conditioning, but it also raised serious ethical concerns about the emotional well-being of children used in experiments. In 1920, psychologist John B. Watson, the founder of behaviorism, wanted to prove that emotions, just like physical reflexes, could be conditioned. He believed that humans were born as blank slates and that fear, love, and anger were not innate but learned responses. To test this, Watson conducted an experiment with a 9-month-old baby named Albert. Albert was a calm and happy child, with no noticeable fear of animals. Watson introduced him to a variety of objects, including a white rat, a rabbit, a monkey, and a mask. At first, Albert showed no fear of these items and even played with the white rat. Then came the cruel twist. Every time Albert reached out to touch the rat, Watson struck a metal pipe with a hammer, producing an extremely loud and frightening noise. The baby flinched, cried, and showed distress. This was repeated multiple times over the next few weeks. Soon, Albert began to associate the rat with fear. He no longer needed the loud noise to be afraid. Just seeing the rat made him panic and cry. Even more disturbingly, the fear spread to similar objects. Albert became terrified of anything white and fluffy, including rabbits, fur coats, and even Santa Claus's beard. This experiment was groundbreaking because it proved that fears can be taught through experience. It provided the foundation for what is now called classical conditioning, a principle widely used in behavior therapy today. However, Watson's study had serious ethical issues. He never deconditioned Albert, meaning the child was left with lasting fears. Worse, the experiment ended abruptly, and Albert was lost to history, with no records of what happened to him later in life. Some researchers believe he may have lived with lifelong phobias. Watson's work contributed to the understanding of fear and behavior, but at the cost of a child's well-being. Today, such an experiment would be unthinkable due to modern ethical standards in psychological research. The Monster Study. The Monster Study is one of the most disturbing and unethical psychological experiments ever conducted. It was meant to understand speech disorders, but instead, it psychologically damaged a group of orphaned children for life. In 1939, speech pathologist Wendell Johnson and his graduate student Mary Tudor conducted the experiment at the University of Iowa. They wanted to prove that stuttering is not biological, but learned, that children develop speech problems due to negative reinforcement rather than genetic factors. To test this, they selected 22 orphaned children, some of whom had slight speech impediments, while others spoke perfectly normally. The children were divided into two groups. One group was given positive encouragement. They were constantly praised for their speech, told that they spoke well, and were encouraged to keep practicing. The other group was subjected to harsh criticism. They were told that they stuttered terribly, that they were speaking wrong, and that they needed to fix themselves. The researchers made them self-conscious and afraid to speak, often punishing them for making mistakes. The results were catastrophic. Many of the children who had no speech problems before the experiment developed severe speech anxiety. They became withdrawn, afraid to talk, and insecure. Some actually began stuttering, even though they had never stuttered before. Those who already had speech difficulties became far worse, struggling to speak without hesitation or fear. The damage was lifelong. Many of the children grew up with severe self-doubt, social anxiety, and communication problems. They suffered from low self-esteem, and some never fully recovered from the psychological wounds inflicted on them as children. The name Monster Study was later given to the experiment because of the cruelty inflicted on innocent children. Unlike other famous experiments that revealed important psychological truths, this study was conducted without any valid justification. It harmed children for no scientific gain. Years later, the University of Iowa formally apologized for the study, and some of the surviving victims received financial compensation. But no amount of money could undo the psychological trauma they endured. This experiment remains one of the darkest stains in the history of psychology, a reminder of how science without ethics can become monstrous. The David Reimer case. The David Reimer case is one of the most horrifying real-life psychological experiments in history. It was a tragic violation of human dignity, driven by a scientist's obsession with proving that gender identity is purely a social construct. David Reimer was born Bruce Reimer in 1965 in Canada. As an infant, he and his twin brother were taken to the hospital for a routine circumcision. But a terrible mistake was made. The doctor accidentally burned off Bruce's penis using an electrical device. His parents were devastated and desperate for a solution. That's when they were approached by Dr. John Money, a psychologist and sexologist, who had a radical theory. He believed that gender is not innate, but can be completely shaped by upbringing. Dr. Money persuaded Bruce's parents to raise him as a girl. He told them that if Bruce underwent surgical reconstruction and was raised as Brenda, he would grow up to fully embrace being female and never realize he had been born a boy. At just 22 months old, Bruce underwent sex reassignment surgery. His parents were instructed to dress him in girls' clothes, give him dolls, and treat him as a daughter. They were told never to reveal the truth. But the experiment was a disaster. As Brenda grew up, nothing felt right. She rejected dresses and dolls, preferred to play with her twin brother's toys, and hated being forced into female roles. She felt like something was deeply wrong, but didn't know why. Dr. Money, however, was determined to prove his theory. He conducted disturbing therapy sessions, forcing Brenda and her twin brother to simulate sexual behaviors to reinforce gender roles. He used shame, intimidation, and psychological manipulation to make Brenda act more feminine. By the time Brenda was a teenager, she was suffering from severe depression, suicidal thoughts, and identity confusion. Finally, at age 14, her parents told her the truth. She had been born male. The revelation was both a relief and a nightmare. Brenda immediately chose to retransition, changing her name to David Reimer and undergoing reconstructive surgery to reclaim his male identity. But the trauma had already left irreversible scars. David's life was filled with emotional pain and psychological struggles. His twin brother also suffered from the distress of the experiment, developing mental health issues and drug addiction. In 2002, his brother died by overdose. 2 years later, at age 38, David took his own life, unable to escape the horrors inflicted upon him. Dr. Money never admitted wrongdoing. He continued to promote his theory, even though it had destroyed lives. The David Reimer case remains one of the most tragic psychological experiments in history. It proved the exact opposite of what Dr. Money intended. Gender identity is deeply rooted in biology, not just environment. This case is now a dark warning against unethical experimentation on humans, especially children. It shows the devastating consequences of trying to force identity rather than letting it develop naturally. The Pit of Despair. The Pit of Despair experiment was one of the most inhumane psychological studies ever conducted. Designed to study depression and social isolation, it ended up being so cruel that its creator, psychologist Harry Harlow, later admitted it was his darkest work. Harlow was already infamous for his monkey experiments on maternal attachment. He had previously shown that baby monkeys preferred soft, comforting mothers over wire mothers that provided food, proving that love and comfort are more important than basic survival needs. But in the 1970s, Harlow's focus shifted. He wanted to understand extreme depression, particularly how it develops in people who experience profound social isolation. And so, he created the Pit of Despair, a name that perfectly described its horrifying purpose. The experiment involved newborn rhesus monkeys. After birth, they were immediately separated from their mothers. At first, they were given some social interaction, but when they reached 3 months old, they were placed inside a small, dark steel isolation chamber. Inside the chamber, the monkeys couldn't see anything except the gray walls around them. They had no interaction with other monkeys and no source of comfort. The only thing they had was complete, crushing loneliness. The results were beyond disturbing. After just a few days in isolation, the monkeys stopped playing, stopped moving, and became completely withdrawn. They huddled in the corners of the chamber, refusing to interact even when taken out. Some rocked back and forth in a catatonic state, staring blankly. The longer they were isolated, the more irreversible the damage became. When reintroduced to other monkeys, many of them couldn't socialize at all. Some refused to eat and eventually starved themselves to death. Others became violent and self-destructive, engaging in self-harm or attacking other monkeys. Some were so psychologically broken that even when they had the opportunity to leave isolation, they simply sat there, paralyzed with fear. The longer the monkeys were kept in isolation, the worse the long-term damage. Those isolated for 3 months showed severe depression, but were able to recover somewhat. But those kept isolated for 6 months or more were never the same again. They were permanently socially crippled. Harlow's study confirmed what many psychologists already suspected: social isolation is devastating to mental health. His work directly influenced research on child neglect, depression, and solitary confinement in prisons. It highlighted how early life trauma and lack of human contact can lead to profound psychological disorders. But the experiment remains one of the most controversial in psychological history. The suffering inflicted on the monkeys was so severe that many scientists and animal rights groups called it torture. Even Harlow himself later admitted that the Pit of Despair was too cruel, and some of his own colleagues refused to work with him afterward. Despite its scientific value, no modern ethics board would ever allow an experiment like this to happen today. It stands as a brutal reminder of the cost of psychological research when ethics are ignored. The Pit of Despair was meant to help understand human suffering, but in the process, it created suffering that was both unnecessary and monstrous. The Harlow Monkey Experiments. The Harlow Monkey Experiments are some of the most famous yet deeply disturbing psychological studies ever conducted. They revolutionized the understanding of love, attachment, and child development, but they also involved horrific cruelty towards infant monkeys. In the 1950s and 60s, psychologist Harry Harlow set out to debunk a widely accepted belief in psychology that infants only form bonds with their mothers because of food. At the time, it was thought that love and affection were unimportant in development, and that as long as a child's basic needs were met, emotional care didn't matter. Harlow wanted to prove otherwise, and so he designed a series of experiments using infant rhesus monkeys. Newborn monkeys were separated from their mothers immediately after birth and placed in cages with two artificial mothers. One was made of wire and had a bottle of milk attached to it, providing food. The other was covered in soft cloth but had no milk. If the theory that attachment is purely about food was correct, the monkeys should have spent most of their time with the wire mother, since she provided nourishment, but that's not what happened. The baby monkeys clung to the soft cloth mother for comfort, only going to the wire mother when they were starving. The moment they finished drinking, they would run back to the cloth mother and hold on to her tightly. The results shattered the old theory. Harlow had proven that warmth, affection, and physical comfort were far more important for emotional development than just food. Love and security mattered, but Harlow didn't stop there. He pushed the limits of his experiments to extreme levels of cruelty. In one test, he deliberately frightened the baby monkeys to see which mother they would run to. He placed them in a cage and suddenly introduced a loud, terrifying mechanical toy. Every single time, they would run to the soft cloth mother, proving that they saw her as a source of protection and safety. In another series of experiments, he isolated monkeys for months or even years in total social deprivation. Those monkeys became severely emotionally disturbed, unable to interact with others, and some self-harmed or starved themselves to death. When Harlow tried to introduce these isolated monkeys to other monkeys later in life, they couldn't function socially. They showed no ability to form relationships and often responded with fear or aggression. Perhaps the most disturbing part of his research was his study on motherhood. He took female monkeys that had grown up without mothers and forced them to become mothers themselves. Because they had never learned how to nurture, many of them became abusive. Some ignored their babies completely, while others violently attacked or even killed them. The Harlow monkey experiments changed psychology forever. They proved that love, comfort, and emotional security were vital for healthy development. His research led to major reforms in how orphanages, hospitals, and child-rearing practices were conducted. But the cruelty of the experiments was undeniable. Harlow's methods were brutal and inhumane, and many of his monkeys suffered lifelong emotional damage. Today, no ethics board would ever approve such experiments, but the lessons learned from them changed the way we understand human attachment forever. The Blue Eyes versus Brown Eyes experiment. The Blue Eyes versus Brown Eyes experiment was one of the most shocking and controversial social experiments ever conducted in a classroom. It exposed the reality of discrimination in a way that was painful, eye-opening, and unforgettable. In 1968, a day after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., a third-grade teacher named Jane Elliott decided to teach her students a lesson about racism and prejudice, not through words, but through experience. She divided her class into two groups based on a random physical trait, eye color. On the first day, she told the class that blue-eyed children were superior. She gave them extra privileges like longer recess time, special seating, and permission to use the playground equipment first. The brown-eyed children, on the other hand, were given no privileges. Worse, they were forced to wear collars around their necks to mark them as inferior. The results were immediate and shocking. The blue-eyed children quickly embraced their new status. They mocked and insulted the brown-eyed children, calling them stupid, lazy, and dirty. Some even refused to play with their brown-eyed friends, despite having been close before the experiment. The brown-eyed children, who had been confident and happy just the day before, became anxious, withdrawn, and insecure. Their schoolwork suffered. Some even cried, struggling to cope with the sudden discrimination. The next day, Elliot reversed the roles. Now, she told the class that brown-eyed children were superior, while blue-eyed children were the lesser group. The same thing happened, but this time, the brown-eyed children became dominant, and the blue-eyed children felt powerless and humiliated. By the end of the exercise, Elliot asked the children how it felt to be judged and mistreated based on something they had no control over. The students, who had never experienced discrimination before, were deeply shaken and ashamed. Many realized that this is what people of color face every day. The experiment was a powerful demonstration of how quickly prejudice can take hold. It showed that discrimination is not based on logic or merit. It's completely arbitrary. Even young children, who were good friends, were willing to turn against each other based on a single fabricated difference. But the experiment was also highly controversial. Many parents were outraged, accusing Elliot of mentally traumatizing the children. Some argued that it was too extreme for such a young age, but Elliot defended her decision, saying that her students never forgot the lesson and that some of them went on to become lifelong advocates against racism. In the years that followed, Jane Elliot conducted this experiment many times with adults, including corporate employees, law enforcement officers, and college students. The results were always the same. People immediately conformed to their assigned roles, proving that discrimination is not just about race, it's about power and perception. The blue eyes versus brown eyes experiment remains one of the most famous social experiments in history. It exposed how easily discrimination is created and how devastating it can be. While some see it as a groundbreaking lesson in empathy, others view it as ethically questionable due to the emotional distress it caused. But one thing is certain: those who experienced it never forgot what it felt like to be treated as less than. It remains a powerful warning about the dangers of prejudice, groupthink, and blind acceptance of social hierarchies. The MKUltra experiments. The MKUltra experiments were among the most disturbing and secretive psychological studies ever conducted. Launched by the CIA during the Cold War, these experiments aimed to develop mind control techniques, but they resulted in unimaginable human suffering, illegal drug testing, and psychological torture. In the 1950s and 1960s, the U.S. government feared that the Soviet Union and China were developing advanced mind control methods. They believed that brainwashing could be used to turn prisoners of war into spies or make people act against their will. In response, the CIA launched MKUltra, a highly classified research program to explore ways to manipulate and control the human mind. The experiments were brutal and unethical. The CIA funded over 150 secret projects across hospitals, universities, and prisons, often without the subject's knowledge. Many of the victims were mental patients, prisoners, drug addicts, and even unwitting civilians. Some of the most horrifying aspects of MKUltra involved extreme LSD testing, where subjects were involuntarily dosed with the drug to see if it could be used for mind control. Many suffered from permanent psychosis or were left in a catatonic state, never recovering. Others were subjected to sleep deprivation for days or even weeks, then given hallucinogens to see how their minds would break. Electroshock therapy was another common method, with victims receiving high-voltage shocks while being forced to listen to repetitive messages in an attempt to reprogram their thoughts. Sensory deprivation was another technique, with individuals being locked in pitch-black rooms for weeks at a time, leading to hallucinations, paranoia, and complete mental breakdowns. Some subjects were hypnotized and drugged with sedatives and stimulants in succession, creating a state of extreme confusion and dissociation. One of the most infamous cases was that of Frank Olson, a scientist who worked for the CIA. After being secretly given LSD without his knowledge, he suffered a mental breakdown. Days later, he fell to his death from a 13th-floor hotel window. Officials claimed it was suicide, but many believe he was murdered to keep MK Ultra secret. For decades, the horrors of MK Ultra remained hidden. In 1973, as government investigations began, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered most MK Ultra documents to be destroyed, erasing much of the evidence. However, in 1975, a few surviving records surfaced, revealing the shocking extent of the experiments. The MK Ultra experiments remain one of the darkest chapters in American history. They showed how far governments could go in the name of national security, violating basic human rights and leaving victims with lifelong trauma. While some argue that MK Ultra helped develop modern interrogation techniques, others see it as nothing more than state-sponsored torture disguised as science. The Landis Facial Expression Experiment. The Landis Facial Expression Experiment is one of the most bizarre and unethical psychological studies ever conducted. It was designed to map human emotions, but instead, it traumatized participants and subjected them to disturbing experiences that served no real scientific purpose. In 1924, psychologist Carney Landis at the University of Minnesota wanted to answer a simple question. Do all humans make the same facial expressions when experiencing emotions like fear, disgust, and happiness? To test this, he recruited students and brought them into a lab. Their faces were painted with black lines to clearly mark the movement of their facial muscles. To trigger emotional responses, Landis subjected the participants to a series of disturbing experiences. He exposed them to strong ammonia fumes, making them cough and recoil. He played loud, sudden noises to startle them and forced them to touch slimy, unpleasant objects. He also showed them graphic photographs of injuries and bodily mutilation, hoping to capture the precise moment of disgust or horror. But the most shocking part of the experiment was the final test. Each participant was handed a live rat and told to decapitate it with a knife. Most were horrified and refused immediately, unable to fathom harming an innocent animal. But Landis pressured them, insisting that it was part of the experiment. Some, overwhelmed by the psychological pressure, went through with it. Those who did were visibly distressed and shaken, struggling to kill the rat cleanly. Others continued to refuse, only to watch in horror as Landis decapitated the rat himself in front of them, just to observe their reactions. He wanted to see if their facial expressions changed when they witnessed unexpected violence. The experiment was not only ethically horrifying, but also completely pointless. Landis found that facial expressions were inconsistent and varied from person to person, meaning the entire study proved nothing useful. It did not lead to any groundbreaking discoveries about human emotions, nor did it advance psychological understanding. The emotional toll, however, was real. Participants left the experiment traumatized, some suffering from emotional distress and guilt for the rest of their lives. The study was widely condemned for its lack of ethics and cruelty, as it forced people to violate their own moral boundaries in the name of science. Today, the Landis Facial Expression Experiment is remembered as one of the most unnecessary and inhumane studies in psychology. It serves as an example of how curiosity can lead to unethical and disturbing research when morality is ignored. The Robbers Cave Experiment. The Robbers Cave Experiment is one of the most famous psychological studies on group conflict and prejudice. Conducted in 1954 by social psychologist Muzaffer Sherif, this study demonstrated how easily hostility can be created between groups and how difficult it is to undo. Sheriff wanted to explore how and why humans form in-groups and out-groups, and whether competition alone could trigger conflict. To test this, he set up a real-life summer camp for 22 boys, all aged 11 to 12 years old. None of them knew each other beforehand, and they were carefully selected to be psychologically stable, middle class, and from similar backgrounds to avoid pre-existing bias. The boys were divided into two separate groups and placed in different areas of the camp. They had no idea that the other group existed for the first few days. During this time, they were encouraged to bond through cooperative activities like hiking, swimming, and teamwork challenges. Each group naturally formed a strong identity and named themselves. One became the Eagles, the other the Rattlers. They developed group pride and became loyal to their members. Then, Sharif introduced competition. The groups were brought together and forced to compete against each other in games, sports, and resource-based challenges. The winning team would receive prizes, while the losing team would get nothing. Almost immediately, hostility exploded. The groups began to insult each other, sabotage games, steal from each other, and even engage in physical fights. The experiment proved how easily humans can turn against each other, even when they had no real reason to. But what Sheriff wanted to test next was even more important. Could the hostility be reversed? At first, he tried forcing the groups to interact socially, having them eat together or share camp activities. But this only made things worse. The boys were too deeply divided, and their hatred had grown too strong. Finally, Sharif introduced a new strategy, a common enemy, and shared goals. He created situations that required both groups to cooperate. He staged an emergency where the camp's water supply broke, and the only way to fix it was if both groups worked together. Later, he staged another crisis. A truck carrying food got stuck, and the boys could only retrieve their meals if they pooled their strength. This worked. As the boys faced these real challenges together, the barriers slowly disappeared. By the end of the camp, former enemies were helping each other, sharing resources, and even riding home on the same bus as friends. The Robbers Cave experiment remains one of the most powerful demonstrations of how group divisions form, escalate, and can be repaired. It revealed that conflict doesn't require deep-seated hatred, just competition over limited resources. More importantly, it showed that the best way to unite people is to give them a shared problem to solve together. However, the experiment was also highly manipulative, as the boys had no idea they were being studied or psychologically influenced. Today, ethical concerns would prevent such a deceptive study, but its findings remain highly relevant in understanding everything from racial tensions and political rivalries to corporate and international conflicts. The Third Wave Experiment. The Third Wave Experiment is one of the most shocking demonstrations of how easily people can be conditioned to accept authoritarianism. Conducted in 1967 by high school history teacher Ron Jones, this experiment showed how quickly democracy can collapse when people blindly follow authority. Jones was teaching his students about Nazi Germany when one of them asked, "How could people allow something like that to happen?" Instead of answering with a lecture, Jones decided to show them firsthand. He told his class that they were part of a new movement called the Third Wave, a social experiment designed to instill discipline, order, and unity. He introduced strict rules, including standing at attention before speaking, addressing him as Mr. Jones, and marching into class in military formation. What began as a simple classroom exercise quickly spiraled into something far more disturbing. The students embraced the experiment with alarming enthusiasm. They took pride in their obedience, reported classmates who disobeyed, and bullied those who questioned the movement. By the third day, hundreds of students from other classes had joined, eager to be part of the elite group. The class became obsessed with secrecy. Members of the Third Wave began to spy on each other, enforcing rules more strictly than even Jones had intended. Some students denounced their best friends for not fully participating, while others acted as enforcers, ensuring that everyone complied. By the fourth day, Jones realized that the experiment had gone too far. The students had become blind followers, abandoning critical thinking, individuality, and morality in favor of obedience and belonging. To end it, he gathered them all into the school auditorium and told them that they were about to witness a televised speech from their national leader. As the students eagerly waited, Jones turned on a blank screen. After a few minutes of silence, he turned to them and said, "You were fooled. There is no leader. You were just as willing to follow a dictator as the German people were under Hitler." The students were stunned. Some burst into tears, realizing they had betrayed their friends and abandoned their own values in just a few days. Others sat in shocked silence, unable to believe how quickly they had lost control of their own thinking. The third wave experiment was a terrifying demonstration of how quickly a group can fall into authoritarianism. It showed that even educated people, given the right conditions, will trade freedom for order, morality for loyalty, and personal judgment for group acceptance. Jones later admitted that he himself was shocked by how easily the students embraced dictatorship, proving that the dangers of group psychology and authoritarian conditioning are not just historical. They are always present. While the experiment was highly effective, it was also ethically questionable. The students were not fully aware that they were being manipulated, and many were traumatized after realizing how quickly they had conformed to an oppressive ideology. However, its lesson remains profoundly relevant today, showing how political movements, social pressures, and propaganda can lead even rational individuals to support dangerous ideologies without question. The third wave is now taught in schools worldwide, reminding people that the greatest defense against tyranny is awareness. The moment we stop questioning authority, we become vulnerable to blind obedience and manipulation. The Learned Helplessness Experiment. The Learned Helplessness Experiment is one of the most disturbing and influential psychological studies ever conducted. It demonstrated how prolonged suffering and a lack of control can break a person's will to fight back, even when escape is possible. This concept became critical in understanding depression, trauma, and abusive relationships. In the 1960s, psychologist Martin Seligman and his colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania conducted a series of experiments using dogs to study how behavior is shaped by negative experiences. The goal was to understand why some animals and people stop trying to escape painful situations, even when a way out is available. The experiment was set up in 3 phases. In the first phase, dogs were divided into 3 groups. The first group was simply placed in a harness and then released. The second group was placed in a harness and subjected to random electric shocks, but they had a lever they could press to stop the shocks. The third group was also given electric shocks, but there was no way for them to stop it. They were completely powerless. In the second phase, all the dogs were placed into a large box divided into 2 sections. One side delivered electric shocks, while the other side was safe. The dogs could easily escape the shocks by jumping over a low barrier to the safe side. The results were shocking. The dogs from the first 2 groups quickly learned to jump over the barrier to escape the shocks, but the dogs from the third group, the ones who had previously been helpless, did nothing. They simply laid down and whined, not even trying to escape, even though they could have easily jumped to safety. They had been conditioned to believe that their actions were meaningless, so they gave up entirely. They had learned helplessness. This discovery had massive implications for human psychology. It explained why people in abusive relationships, prisoners or trauma survivors, often fail to escape their situations, even when a way out exists. If someone is repeatedly subjected to failure, punishment, or suffering with no control over their fate, they may stop trying to change their circumstances, even if the situation changes. Further studies revealed that this also applies to depression. Many depressed individuals feel powerless over their own emotions and circumstances, leading them to stop trying to improve their lives because they believe nothing will work. However, Seligman also found a hopeful side to his research. Just as helplessness can be learned, so can optimism and resilience. If individuals are taught that they can control aspects of their lives, they can break out of helplessness and regain motivation. The learned helplessness experiment remains a crucial study in psychology, explaining why people sometimes stay trapped in bad situations and how they can be helped to regain control over their lives. However, the cruelty of shocking animals has made it one of the most ethically controversial experiments in history. The Well of Despair. The Well of Despair is one of the most inhumane and disturbing psychological experiments ever conducted. It was designed to study depression and social isolation, but instead it inflicted unimaginable suffering on helpless baby monkeys. This brutal experiment was conducted in the 1970s by Harry Harlow, the same psychologist behind the Harlow monkey experiments on attachment, while his previous research had shown that love and comfort were essential for healthy development. This time, Harlow wanted to study the effects of extreme isolation on mental health. To do this, he created a small, dark, steel isolation chamber, a device he chillingly named the Well of Despair. Harlow took newborn rhesus monkeys away from their mothers and placed them inside this cold, empty, silent cage for different periods of time. Some were isolated for days, others for months, and some for over a year. The results were horrifying. Within days, the baby monkeys stopped playing, stopped moving, and became completely withdrawn. They huddled in the corners, refused to interact, and rocked back and forth in a catatonic state. Many would simply sit motionless for hours, staring at nothing. The longer they were isolated, the worse the damage. Those kept in isolation for 3 months developed severe depression, but could partially recover when reintroduced to other monkeys. But those isolated for 6 months or longer were never the same again. When placed with other monkeys, they could not socialize. Some refused to eat, and others became violently aggressive or engaged in self-harm, biting themselves, tearing out their own fur, or banging their heads against the walls. Some monkeys never recovered, even when given opportunities to rejoin normal social groups. They remained permanently withdrawn, incapable of forming any connections or relationships. Perhaps the most tragic part of the experiment came when Harlow tested whether these socially deprived monkeys could become mothers themselves. When female monkeys who had been raised in isolation were artificially impregnated, many of them became abusive. Some ignored their babies completely, while others physically harmed or even killed them. The Well of Despair experiment proved that social isolation can cause irreversible psychological damage. It confirmed that love, affection, and social interaction are critical for mental health, not just in monkeys, but in humans as well. This research later influenced studies on child neglect, solitary confinement in prisons, and the long-term effects of social deprivation. However, the experiment is widely condemned as one of the cruelest in psychological history. The suffering inflicted on the monkeys was so extreme that even Harlow's own colleagues were horrified. Some scientists refused to work with him after seeing the results, and the experiment contributed to growing movements for ethical treatment of animals in research. Today, no ethics board would ever approve such a monstrous study. The Well of Despair remains one of the darkest moments in psychological research, a terrifying demonstration of the consequences of complete isolation. It serves as a grim reminder that deprivation of love and social connection can be just as damaging as physical harm. The Baby Alberts Generalization Experiment. The Baby Albert experiment is one of the most infamous psychological studies ever conducted. It demonstrated how fear could be artificially created in humans, but it also exposed the horrifying lack of ethics in early psychology. Even worse, the experiment permanently traumatized a baby and left lingering questions about his fate. In 1920, psychologist John B. Watson, the founder of behaviorism, set out to prove that emotions, especially fear, were not innate, but instead learned through experience. He believed that human behavior was entirely shaped by the environment, and he wanted to demonstrate that even something as fundamental as fear could be conditioned. To test his theory, Watson and his assistant Rosalie Rayner selected a 9-month-old baby named Albert. Albert was a happy, fearless infant. Initially, he was introduced to a variety of objects, including a white rat, a rabbit, a dog, a monkey, cotton wool, and a mask. At first, he showed no fear at all and was happy to play with the rat. Then came the cruel twist. As Albert reached out to touch the rat, Watson suddenly struck a metal pipe with a hammer, producing an extremely loud, jarring noise. The sound terrified Albert, making him flinch and cry. Watson repeated this over and over, each time pairing the harmless white rat with the terrifying noise. Soon, Albert didn't need the noise to feel fear. Just seeing the white rat made him panic and cry. Watson had successfully conditioned fear into the baby. But the experiment didn't stop there. Watson wanted to see if the fear would spread to other objects. This is where generalization came into play. Albert not only became afraid of the rat, but also anything that resembled it. He panicked at the sight of rabbits, dogs, fur coats, Santa Claus's beard, and even white cotton wool. His fear had become irrational and uncontrollable. Watson had proven his theory, but at a terrible cost. Even worse, Albert was never deconditioned. In modern psychology, researchers have an ethical responsibility to reverse any harm caused during an experiment. But Watson simply ended the study and left Albert with his newfound fears. What happened to Albert afterward remains a tragic mystery. Some researchers believe he may have lived with lifelong phobias, while others suggest he died of illness at age 6, never having the chance to grow up and recover from the trauma. The Baby Albert experiment is now regarded as one of the most unethical studies in psychology. It permanently damaged a child for the sake of proving a theory that could have been demonstrated without harming an innocent baby. While it played a crucial role in the development of behavioral psychology, it also sparked discussions about ethics in psychological research. Today, such an experiment would be completely illegal, but it serves as a grim reminder of a time when scientific curiosity often outweighed morality, leaving behind victims who never had a choice. The suicide experiment. The suicide experiment is one of the most disturbing and ethically controversial psychological studies ever conducted. It attempted to understand the psychology of suicide, but in doing so, it pushed participants to the edge of emotional collapse. In the 1960s, psychologist Dr. Kurt Richter wanted to study why people and animals give up on life. He had observed that in stressful conditions, some creatures fought to survive, while others simply surrendered and died, even when an escape was possible. This led him to investigate how the mind influences survival and, ultimately, the act of giving up. His experiment began with rats. He placed them in tanks of water to see how long they would swim before drowning. Initially, the rats paddled for an average of 15 minutes before giving up and sinking. But then, he changed the experiment. He rescued some of the rats just before they drowned, dried them off, gave them a short break, and then placed them back in the water. The results were shocking. The rats that had been rescued once didn't give up after 15 minutes anymore. They kept swimming for an average of 60 hours before drowning. That was 240 times longer than the first group. Why? The rats that had been saved once had learned hope. They had experienced rescue, and so they kept fighting, believing that survival was possible. Richter concluded that when living beings believe there is no hope, they surrender quickly. But when they have even a small reason to believe they will be saved, they will fight far longer than expected. Although his research was originally done with animals, the implications for human psychology were clear. People who believe their suffering is inescapable, whether due to depression, abuse, or extreme stress, are more likely to give up on life entirely. But those who have experienced hope, support, or rescue are far more likely to hold on and fight through difficult times. This study laid the foundation for understanding learned helplessness and suicide prevention. It showed that hopelessness is the greatest killer, but it also showed that hope, no matter how small, can be enough to keep someone going. However, the suicide experiment remains ethically horrifying. It forced animals to drown in order to study their last moments. Many argue that the findings could have been achieved in a more humane way. Despite its controversial nature, this study is often referenced in discussions about suicide, depression, and resilience. It serves as a chilling reminder that despair can be deadly, but hope, even in the smallest doses, can be the difference between life and death. The car crash memory experiment. The car crash memory experiment is one of the most well-known psychological studies on false memories and the fragility of human perception. Conducted by Elizabeth Loftus and John Palmer in 1974, it demonstrated that the way a question is worded can influence how people remember events, ultimately proving that memory is far less reliable than we often believe. Loftus and Palmer wanted to test whether language could distort memory recall. They gathered a group of participants and showed them short films depicting car accidents. After watching the videos, the participants were asked to estimate the speed of the cars. However, each group received slightly different versions of the question. Some were asked, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? Others were asked, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? The results revealed that language choice significantly altered perception. Participants who were asked about cars that smashed estimated much higher speeds than those who were asked about cars that merely hit. The simple difference in phrasing completely changed how participants recalled the accident, even though everyone had seen the exact same footage. A week later, the participants were called back and asked if they had seen broken glass in the accident. In reality, there was no broken glass in the video, but those who had been asked about cars smashing into each other were much more likely to falsely remember shattered glass. This suggested that their memories had been altered by a single word. The implications of this study were profound, especially in the field of eyewitness testimony. Loftus's findings showed that people can unintentionally implant false memories in others simply by framing questions in a certain way. This meant that in criminal cases, witnesses could be subtly influenced by the way police officers, lawyers, or journalists questioned them, leading to distorted recollections and wrongful convictions. Beyond the legal system, the study raised concerns about the reliability of human memory in general. If something as simple as word choice could rewrite a person's recollection of an event, then misinformation in news media, propaganda, and even casual conversations could shape history and personal experiences in ways that were completely false. The car crash memory experiment is a chilling reminder that memory is not a fixed recording of the past. Instead, it is a fluid, malleable construct, easily influenced by suggestion. This study fundamentally changed the way psychology understands memory, proving that what we remember is not always what actually happened. The Good Samaritan experiment. The Good Samaritan experiment is one of the most disturbing demonstrations of how external circumstances, rather than personal morality, dictate human behavior. Conducted in 1973 by John Darley and Daniel Batson, this study exposed an uncomfortable truth. Even people who believe in kindness and helping others will ignore someone in distress if they are in a rush. The experiment took place at Princeton Theological Seminary, where students were training to become ministers. The researchers wanted to determine whether time pressure would affect a person's willingness to help someone in need. To test this, they told the students they were going to deliver a speech in a nearby building. Half of the students were assigned to give a talk about the parable of the Good Samaritan, a biblical story about helping strangers in distress. The other half were given a completely unrelated topic. Before sending them to the building, the researchers manipulated their sense of urgency. Some students were told they were already late and needed to hurry, while others were told they had plenty of time. On their way to give their speech, the students encountered a man slumped in an alleyway, coughing and appearing to be in serious distress. This man was actually an actor, placed there to see if the students would stop and help him. The results were shocking. The biggest factor determining whether someone stopped to help was not their religious beliefs, their topic of discussion, or their commitment to kindness. It was simply how much time they thought they had. Students who were in a rush were far less likely to stop, while those who believed they had extra time were significantly more likely to help. Even more disturbingly, the students who had just prepared a speech about the Good Samaritan, a story specifically about helping those in need, were just as likely to ignore the suffering man as those who had another topic. Some were so focused on getting to their destination that they literally stepped over the struggling man without acknowledging him. This experiment revealed a chilling insight into human nature. Morality is often thought of as an internal quality, something that people carry with them in all situations. But this study showed that context and external pressures can override personal values, even for those who have dedicated their lives to service and kindness. The implications were unsettling. If future ministers, people who were training specifically to help others, could ignore a suffering person simply because they were in a hurry, then what does that say about the rest of society? The study suggested that people are not as altruistic as they believe, and that when placed in high-pressure situations, they will often prioritize their own responsibilities over another person's suffering. This research had profound real-world applications. It helped explain why people often fail to help in emergencies, especially in fast-paced environments like cities or workplaces. It also contributed to the bystander effect, the phenomenon where individuals are less likely to help in an emergency if they believe others will do it instead. The Good Samaritan experiment remains one of the most powerful and disturbing social psychology studies ever conducted. It forces us to confront an unsettling question: would I stop to help, or would I, like so many others, keep walking because I was too busy to care? The Asch Conformity Experiment. The Asch Conformity Experiment is one of the most well-known studies in psychology, demonstrating the power of social influence and peer pressure. Conducted by Solomon Asch in 1951, it revealed a disturbing truth about human behavior. People are more likely to conform to the group, even when they know the group is wrong. Asch wanted to explore how much peer pressure could influence an individual's decision-making, even when the correct answer was obvious. He recruited participants for what they believed was a vision test. Each participant was placed in a room with a group of other people, but what they didn't know was that the other people were actors working for Asch. The group was shown a series of cards, each displaying a line. They were then shown 3 comparison lines and asked which one matched the original in length. The task was ridiculously simple. In the first few rounds, everyone gave the correct answer. But then, the real experiment began. The actors started deliberately giving the wrong answers, claiming that a line that was clearly shorter or longer was actually the correct match. The real participant was seated near the end of the group, meaning they had to listen as multiple people confidently gave the same incorrect answer before it was their turn. The results were shocking. Even though the correct answer was obvious, most participants conformed to the group's incorrect answer at least once. Overall, 75% of participants gave the wrong answer at least once just to match the group, even when their eyes told them something different. When asked why they went along with the incorrect answers, many participants admitted that they knew the group was wrong but felt uncomfortable going against the majority. Others said they began to doubt their own judgment, wondering if they had misperceived the lines. The Asch conformity experiment proved that social pressure can override personal judgment, even when the stakes are low. If people were willing to deny their own perception of reality just to fit in with a group over something as meaningless as line lengths, what would they do in higher stakes situations? The study had profound implications for understanding groupthink, peer pressure, and societal influence. It helped explain why people conform to political ideologies, social trends, or even dangerous cults. It also provided insight into how dictatorships and authoritarian regimes manipulate the masses by creating an environment where disagreeing with the group feels uncomfortable or even dangerous. Today, the Asch experiment serves as a powerful reminder that humans are wired for conformity. It forces us to ask, how often do we go along with something we don't truly believe in just because everyone else seems to agree? The Bobo doll experiment. The Bobo doll experiment is one of the most famous psychological studies on how children learn aggression. Conducted by Albert Bandura in 1961, this study proved that children don't just imitate behaviors, they absorb and replicate them even without being directly encouraged. Bandura wanted to test the idea that aggression is learned through observation rather than something purely innate. At the time, many psychologists believed that children only acted aggressively when they were directly rewarded for doing so. Bandura suspected otherwise. He believed that children could learn violent behavior simply by watching others act violently. To test this, Bandura placed children in a room filled with toys and an inflatable clown doll called a Bobo doll. Some children were placed in a control group where they played normally, but others were placed in a room where they watched an adult interact with the Bobo doll in a highly aggressive manner, punching it, kicking it, and even hitting it with a hammer while shouting violent phrases like, "Sock him in the nose!" Afterward, the children were left alone in the room with the Bobo doll. The results were disturbing. The children who had witnessed the violent adult were far more likely to attack the doll themselves, using the same aggressive actions and phrases they had seen. Many even picked up a toy hammer and struck the doll, just as the adult had done. In contrast, the children in the control group, who had not seen an aggressive role model, rarely displayed violent behavior toward the doll. This confirmed Bandura's theory. Children learn aggression not just through direct reinforcement, but by simply observing others act violently. The experiment was later repeated with slight variations, such as replacing the adult with a video recording. The results remained the same. Children who saw aggression, whether in person or on a screen, were more likely to mimic it. This study had massive implications, particularly in the debate about violence in media and its impact on children. Bandura's findings suggested that exposure to violent movies, video games, and television could shape children's behavior in the real world, leading to increased aggression. However, the experiment also showed that children are just as capable of learning positive behaviors. In later studies, when children observed adults behaving kindly and cooperatively, they imitated those behaviors instead. This meant that while violence could be learned, so could empathy, kindness, and self-control. The Bobo doll experiment changed the way psychologists understood learning and aggression. It provided solid evidence that children absorb the actions they see around them, whether from parents, teachers, peers, or media. It also helped shape modern parenting, education, and media regulations, reinforcing the idea that what children see, they become. Bandura's research is still highly relevant today, especially in discussions about violent entertainment, social media, and the responsibility of role models. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality. If we want to reduce violence in society, we need to be mindful of the behaviors we expose children to, because they are always watching, learning, and repeating. The facial disfigurement experiment. The facial disfigurement experiment is one of the most unsettling psychological studies ever conducted. It demonstrated how deeply ingrained social biases and perception distortions can influence human behavior, particularly in the way people react to physical appearance. In the 1960s, psychologists wanted to explore how people's behavior changes when they believe they are physically disfigured. The researchers selected a group of participants and told them they would be wearing a special makeup prosthetic that would make them appear as though they had a severe facial scar. A makeup artist applied what seemed to be a realistic disfigurement to each participant's face. The researchers then handed them a small mirror, allowing them to see their new, scarred appearance. The goal was to make them fully aware of how others would perceive them before sending them out into public spaces. However, the true experiment had a cruel deception. Just before the participants left the room, the researchers pretended to do a final touch-up, but instead of adding more makeup, they secretly removed the scar entirely. The participants believed they still had the facial disfigurement, but in reality, their faces were completely normal. The participants were then sent into various social situations, cafes, stores, and public places, while being observed. They later reported back on how they were treated. Almost all of them claimed they experienced discrimination, coldness, or discomfort from others. They believed people were staring at them, treating them differently, or acting awkwardly in conversation because of their supposed facial scars. But in reality, nothing about their appearance had changed. The way they interpreted their interactions was entirely based on their own belief that they were disfigured. This experiment exposed how expectations shape perception. The participants expected to be judged for their appearance, so they projected those expectations onto the people around them. Even though the other people saw them as completely normal, the participants imagined rejection and discomfort where none existed. The findings had profound implications for social psychology and self-esteem. It revealed that when people believe they have a negative trait, whether real or imagined, they are likely to misinterpret neutral social interactions as negative experiences. It also highlighted the struggles faced by individuals with real physical differences, showing how self-consciousness can shape social interactions even more than the physical condition itself. The facial disfigurement experiment remains one of the most disturbing demonstrations of how perception can alter reality. It forces us to question how often we misinterpret social situations, not because of how others see us, but because of how we expect them to see us. The electric shock puppy experiment. The electric shock puppy experiment is one of the most disturbing replications of obedience research, proving that people will follow authority even when it means harming an innocent, defenseless creature. Inspired by Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments, psychologists Charles Sheridan and Richard King conducted the study in 1972. They wanted to test whether people would still inflict harm under orders if the victim was a real, living being instead of an actor pretending to feel pain. Unlike Milgram's experiment, where the supposed victim was an actor pretending to be shocked, this study used a real puppy as the test subject. Participants were told they were part of a learning experiment and were instructed to administer increasing levels of electric shocks to the puppy every time it failed to complete a task. The puppy was placed in a box, and participants were seated in another room where they could see the animal but had no way of knowing whether the shocks were real or not. The researchers had rigged the system so that each time the participant pressed a button, the puppy would react, whimpering, yelping, and eventually crying out in pain as the voltage increased. Unlike Milgram's study, where some participants refused to continue after hearing screams from the supposed victim, in this experiment, almost all of the participants obeyed orders and continued shocking the puppy, even as its distress became obvious. A horrifying 77% of participants continued to the maximum shock level, despite visibly breaking down in distress while doing so. Many were crying, shaking, or begging to stop, but when the researchers told them to continue, they kept pressing the button anyway. One of the most chilling aspects of the study was that every single one of the female participants obeyed fully, while only a small number of male participants refused to complete the shocks. This suggested that obedience to authority might be even stronger when emotional distress is high, particularly for those who felt helpless in the situation. The electric shock puppy experiment confirmed the worst fears about human nature. People are capable of following orders to inflict pain, even when they are horrified by their own actions. The study was highly controversial, as it caused real suffering to an innocent animal, making it one of the most ethically condemned experiments in psychology. While it reinforced the findings of the Milgram experiment, it also raised disturbing questions about how far people will go under authority, especially when they believe they have no choice. It remains one of the most painful examples of the dark side of obedience, showing how compassion can be overridden by the pressure to follow orders. The CIA's remote viewing experiments. The CIA's remote viewing experiments, also known as Project Stargate, were part of a highly classified effort to determine whether psychic abilities could be used for intelligence gathering. Conducted from the 1970s to the mid-1990s, these experiments sought to explore whether individuals could use remote viewing, the supposed ability to see distant locations or events using only the mind. The U.S. government became interested in parapsychology after reports surfaced that the Soviet Union was investing in similar research. Fearing that psychic espionage could become a real weapon in the Cold War, the CIA and other intelligence agencies began funding experiments to see if psychic spies could be trained to uncover classified information. The experiments primarily took place at Stanford Research Institute, SRI, where scientists tested individuals who claimed to have extrasensory perception, ESP. The most famous participant was Ingo Swann, a man who believed he could mentally view objects and locations anywhere in the world. Researchers would give Swann geographic coordinates or a vague description and ask him to describe what he saw. He provided detailed drawings and reports of places he had never physically visited. One of the most famous alleged successes of the program was when a remote viewer accurately described the location of a downed Soviet bomber that had been lost in Africa. In another instance, remote viewers were asked to describe a secret Soviet military base and allegedly provided accurate information about its layout. Despite these cases, scientific skepticism remained high. When independent researchers tested remote viewing under strict conditions, the results were no better than chance. Many of the successful descriptions were vague, open to interpretation, or confirmed after the fact, making them highly unreliable for intelligence use. The CIA eventually shut down the program in 1995, concluding that remote viewing was not a viable method of espionage. A declassified report stated that the information obtained was too inconsistent and unreliable to be of any real intelligence value. The remote viewing experiments remain one of the strangest chapters in CIA history, proving that even the most powerful government agencies have explored the supernatural in search of an advantage. While the research failed to provide hard evidence of psychic abilities, It fueled conspiracy theories and public fascination with government interest in the paranormal. The Rosenhan Experiment. The Rosenhan Experiment, conducted in 1973 by psychologist David Rosenhan, exposed the flaws and dangers of psychiatric diagnoses. It remains one of the most disturbing studies on the failures of mental health institutions and the thin line between sanity and insanity. Rosenhan wanted to test whether psychiatric hospitals could reliably distinguish between people who were actually mentally ill and those who were not. To do this, he and 7 other healthy individuals, known as pseudopatients, secretly admitted themselves into psychiatric hospitals across the U.S. Each pseudopatient falsely claimed to hear voices saying the words empty, hollow, and thud. Other than this fabricated symptom, they behaved completely normally. Despite having no real mental illness, every single one of them was diagnosed with schizophrenia or another psychiatric disorder and immediately institutionalized. Once inside, the pseudopatients acted completely sane, yet none of the doctors or staff suspected the deception. They took notes on everything happening around them, but hospital staff interpreted their behavior as evidence of mental illness. If they were caught writing, it was labeled as paranoid behavior. If they politely asked when they might be discharged, it was recorded as exhibiting anxiety. The average length of stay was 19 days, with some pseudopatients trapped inside for over a month, despite never displaying any actual symptoms of mental illness. Not a single doctor recognized that they were sane. Ironically, many actual patients figured it out and told them, "You're not crazy, are you?" Perhaps the most terrifying part was how dehumanizing the psychiatric experience was. Patients were often ignored or dismissed, with hospital staff talking about them as if they weren't in the room. They were forced to take powerful antipsychotic drugs, which they secretly discarded. The experiment revealed that once someone is labeled mentally ill, everything they do is seen through that lens, even completely normal behavior. After the study was published, one hospital challenged Rosenhan and claimed their staff would never be fooled. They invited him to send more pseudopatients, promising they would detect them. Over the next several months, the hospital reported that 41 of their new patients seemed fake. But in reality, Rosenhan had sent no one, proving that psychiatric labels create bias, leading to false assumptions about people's mental states. The Rosenhan experiment caused an uproar in the psychiatric community, forcing massive reforms in how mental health diagnoses were handled. It revealed the subjectivity of psychiatric assessments, proving that once someone is labeled as mentally ill, it is nearly impossible to convince others otherwise. The experiment remains a chilling reminder that mental health institutions, rather than helping patients, can sometimes trap them in a system that refuses to see them as fully human. It raises uncomfortable questions about how many people have been institutionalized, misdiagnosed, or ignored simply because they were seen as crazy from the start. The Invisible Gorilla Experiment. The Invisible Gorilla Experiment is one of the most famous psychological studies demonstrating inattentional blindness, the phenomenon where people fail to notice something unexpected when their attention is focused elsewhere. Conducted by Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris in 1999, this experiment revealed how easily our minds can miss glaringly obvious details, even when we believe we are paying full attention. Participants in the study were shown a short video of people passing a basketball and were given a simple task: count how many times the players wearing white shirts passed the ball. The task required focus, and most participants concentrated intensely on counting the passes. Midway through the video, something completely bizarre happened. A person dressed in a full-body gorilla suit walked into the middle of the scene, pounded their chest, and then walked off. The gorilla was in clear view for nearly 9 seconds, but when asked about it later, around 50% of participants failed to notice it at all. The results shocked both psychologists and the general public. It proved that when people focus on a specific task, they can become completely blind to other events happening right in front of them. The brain prioritizes what it deems important, and everything else, no matter how obvious, can simply disappear from conscious awareness. This experiment had massive implications, particularly in eyewitness testimony, public safety, and driving awareness. It showed why witnesses to crimes might miss crucial details even if they are looking directly at the scene. It also explained why drivers sometimes fail to see pedestrians, cyclists, or even entire vehicles if they are focused on something else. The invisible gorilla experiment shattered the myth that we perceive everything in our environment. It proved that our awareness is far more limited than we think, and that we routinely miss the unexpected, even when it's right in front of us. This study remains a powerful reminder of the limits of human attention and forces us to question how much of the world we truly see. It suggests that we may be walking through life missing more than we realize, simply because our minds are occupied with something else. The Stockholm Syndrome Experiment. The Stockholm Syndrome experiment was not a traditional psychological study, but rather a real-life hostage situation that led to the discovery of one of the most disturbing psychological phenomena ever observed. It showed that people in captivity can develop emotional bonds with their captors, a counterintuitive and deeply unsettling reaction known today as Stockholm Syndrome. The event that inspired the term occurred in 1973 during a bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden. A group of armed criminals entered a bank, took 4 hostages, and held them captive inside the vault for 6 days. The hostages were threatened, abused, and kept in fear, yet strangely, when they were finally rescued, they defended their captors and even resisted police efforts to free them. One of the most shocking elements was that some of the hostages refused to testify against the criminals after they were caught. One hostage even became romantically involved with one of the captors after the event. Psychologists were baffled. Traditionally, victims of kidnapping or abuse were expected to feel anger, hatred, or resentment toward their captors. But in this case, the hostages felt protective of them, sympathized with them, and even believed the police were the real threat. After studying the case, psychologists developed the concept of Stockholm Syndrome, a psychological survival mechanism where captives unconsciously form emotional bonds with their abusers as a way to cope with trauma and increase their chances of survival. Further research showed that this phenomenon wasn't limited to bank hostages. Stockholm Syndrome had been observed in abuse victims, cult members, prisoners of war, and even domestic violence survivors. In extreme situations where victims feel helpless and dependent on their captors, they sometimes begin to rationalize or even justify their mistreatment. The discovery of Stockholm Syndrome led to deeper explorations of how human psychology adapts to extreme conditions. It showed that the mind will sometimes choose attachment over resistance, even in life-threatening situations. While some psychologists argue that Stockholm Syndrome is a misunderstood reaction rather than a formal disorder, its implications are undeniable. It explains why some kidnapping victims refuse to escape, why abuse survivors struggle to leave their abusers, and why people trapped in cults remain loyal to their leaders despite mistreatment. The Stockholm Syndrome case remains one of the most chilling real-world demonstrations of how the human mind can betray its own survival instincts, turning fear into misplaced loyalty. It raises profound questions about how manipulation, control, and psychological dependence can override rational thinking in extreme situations. The Fantz Infant Perception Experiment. The Fantz Infant Perception Experiment was one of the earliest studies that revealed how much newborns are capable of perceiving and understanding the world around them. Conducted by Robert Fantz in the 1960s, this experiment shattered the long-held belief that infants are born as blank slates with no ability to process information. At the time, many psychologists believed that babies had almost no cognitive abilities at birth, and that their perception of the world only developed gradually through experience. Fantz suspected otherwise. He believed that infants might already have preferences and the ability to recognize certain patterns. To test this, he devised a simple yet revolutionary experiment. He placed infants in a controlled environment and showed them different visual stimuli, including plain colors, simple shapes, complex patterns, and human faces. Then, using a technique called preferential looking, he measured how long the babies stared at each object. The results were groundbreaking. The infants spent significantly more time looking at human faces than at any other stimulus. They also showed a preference for complex patterns over plain shapes, suggesting that even newborns seek out and process meaningful visual information rather than just passively observing their surroundings. One of the most important findings was that infants preferred face-like structures, even when the images were nothing more than simple arrangements of dots and lines resembling eyes and a mouth. This suggested that the human brain is hardwired from birth to recognize faces, a critical skill for bonding with caregivers and understanding social interactions. Fantz's experiment transformed the field of developmental psychology. It proved that infants are not passive beings, but active participants in their own cognitive development. His work laid the foundation for modern research on infant perception, early learning, and social recognition. The Fantz infant perception experiment remains a landmark study demonstrating that human perception begins far earlier than once believed. It forces us to reconsider how much newborns actually understand about the world, even before they can speak or interact in a meaningful way. The sensory deprivation tank experiments. The sensory deprivation tank experiments are among the most fascinating and disturbing psychological studies ever conducted. These experiments explored what happens to the human mind when it is completely cut off from external stimulation. What researchers found was both enlightening and terrifying. Prolonged sensory deprivation can lead to hallucinations, paranoia, and even complete psychological breakdowns. In the 1950s, neuroscientist John C. Lilly designed the first sensory deprivation tank, a pitch-black, soundproof chamber filled with body temperature water, allowing a person to float weightlessly. The goal was to see how the brain would react without external sensory input: no light, no sound, no sense of gravity, and no interaction with the outside world. When placed in the tank, participants initially felt deep relaxation. Many reported experiencing a state of complete calm and detachment from their bodies, similar to meditation. But as time passed, their minds began to compensate for the lack of stimulation, and this is where things took a dark turn. Some participants started to hallucinate vividly, seeing shapes, lights, and even entire dreamlike scenes while fully awake. Others reported hearing voices, whispers, or music, despite the complete silence of the tank. Many experienced intense paranoia, feeling as if they were being watched or followed, even though they were completely alone. Lilly and other researchers quickly realized that depriving the brain of external input doesn't silence it. It makes it overactive. The mind, desperate for stimulation, begins to generate its own reality, blurring the line between imagination and perception. The implications were profound. Sensory deprivation was later used in military training, psychological therapy, and even interrogation tactics. Some intelligence agencies experimented with sensory deprivation as a form of psychological torture, keeping prisoners in dark, silent isolation for days or even weeks to break their mental resistance. Despite the darker findings, modern float therapy has emerged from these studies using short-term sensory deprivation for stress relief, relaxation, and enhanced creativity. but the experiments also served as a stark warning. While short-term sensory deprivation can be beneficial, prolonged isolation can lead to severe psychological distress. The sensory deprivation tank experiments remain one of the most thought-provoking studies in psychology, revealing how the mind struggles to function when stripped of external reality. It forces us to question how much of our everyday perception is built by external stimuli and how fragile that perception truly is. The White Room Experiment. The White Room Experiment is one of the most unsettling studies on sensory deprivation and its effects on the human mind. It explored what happens when a person is placed in an environment so sterile and featureless that their brain has nothing to engage with. What researchers found was both disturbing and deeply revealing. When deprived of stimuli, the mind begins to unravel in unpredictable ways. This experiment involved placing participants in a completely white room. The walls, ceiling, and floor were all pure white. The furniture was white. Even the clothes participants wore were white. The room was soundproof, eliminating external noise, and the lighting was bright and uniform, removing shadows and contrast. The idea was to create an environment devoid of any form of sensory variation. At first, the participants found the experience odd but tolerable. Many reported feeling a sense of peace and detachment, similar to being in a meditative state. However, after a few hours, the real effects started to emerge. The lack of variation in color, texture, and sound began to disorient them. With nothing to focus on, their minds started generating their own distractions. Many experienced visual distortions, seeing shapes or movements in the walls that weren't there. Others reported hearing phantom noises despite the silence. As time passed, their perception of time broke down completely. Some believed only minutes had gone by when, in reality, hours had passed. Others felt as if they had been in the room for an eternity, despite only spending a short period inside. The most extreme cases involved hallucinations and paranoia. Some participants saw shadowy figures emerging from the walls or felt as if they were being watched. A few even began talking to themselves, unable to distinguish their own thoughts from reality. The experiment revealed a chilling truth. The human brain cannot function properly without sensory variation. When deprived of stimulation, it tries to fill in the gaps itself, often in terrifying ways. This study had profound implications for understanding solitary confinement, isolation, and sensory deprivation in extreme environments. It showed why prisoners kept in solitary confinement often suffer severe psychological breakdowns, and why astronauts or deep-sea divers need constant mental stimulation to avoid hallucinations and paranoia. The White Room Experiment remains one of the most haunting demonstrations of how fragile human perception is. It forces us to consider how much of our reality is constructed by our senses, and what happens when those senses have nothing left to process. The Sleep Deprivation Torture Studies. The sleep deprivation torture studies are some of the most horrifying psychological experiments ever conducted, exposing the devastating effects of extreme sleeplessness on the human mind. These studies, often performed in military, wartime, and unethical psychological research settings, revealed that severe sleep deprivation doesn't just cause exhaustion. It can break a person's sanity entirely. Sleep is essential for cognitive function, emotional regulation, and physical health. Without it, the body and brain begin to collapse in terrifying ways. In the most infamous sleep deprivation studies, researchers forced participants to stay awake for days or even weeks, documenting the horrifying mental and physical deterioration that followed. Within 24 to 48 hours, participants suffered severe fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and mood swings. They became highly irritable, anxious, and emotionally unstable. After 72 hours, the effects became more extreme. Subjects began hallucinating, seeing figures that weren't there, hearing voices, and struggling to distinguish dreams from reality. Their speech became slurred, and their ability to process even simple thoughts slowed down dramatically. By day 5 and beyond, participants experienced paranoia, delusions, and full-blown psychosis. Some became convinced they were being watched or controlled, while others reported feeling disconnected from their own bodies. The brain, desperate for sleep, forced them into microsleeps, brief, uncontrollable blackouts where they would lose consciousness for a few seconds at a time, even while standing or speaking. One of the most infamous alleged sleep deprivation studies was the Russian sleep experiment, a rumored Cold War-era study in which subjects were supposedly kept awake for 15 days straight using a stimulant gas. According to the unverified account, the subjects descended into madness, self-mutilation, and eventually turned violent. While this particular story is likely a hoax, real-life studies have confirmed that extreme sleep deprivation induces severe cognitive impairment, delusions, and in extreme cases, death. The military and intelligence agencies have long studied sleep deprivation as a form of psychological torture. It is widely used in interrogations, as prolonged wakefulness can break a person's will, making them more susceptible to suggestion and less capable of resisting questioning. Some detainees have reportedly been kept awake for over a week, experiencing hallucinations so severe that they could no longer distinguish reality from delusion. The findings from sleep deprivation studies led to the understanding that prolonged lack of sleep can be just as damaging as physical torture. It disrupts every aspect of brain function, leading to paranoia, hallucinations, extreme emotional instability, and eventually complete cognitive collapse. The sleep deprivation torture studies remain some of the most inhumane psychological experiments ever conducted, exposing the terrifying vulnerability of the human mind when stripped of one of its most basic biological needs. They serve as a chilling reminder that without sleep, the mind begins to self-destruct, turning against itself in the most horrifying ways imaginable. The auto-execution experiment. The auto-execution experiment is one of the most disturbing psychological studies ever recorded, exploring the extreme effects of anticipation, fear, and stress on the human body. While details remain scarce due to ethical concerns, the experiment allegedly demonstrated that the mind alone is capable of killing the body under extreme psychological distress. The basic premise of the experiment was to trick individuals into believing they were about to be executed without actually harming them physically. The goal was to observe whether psychological terror alone could trigger death. In one of the most infamous versions of the experiment, a death row inmate was selected for a secret study. Instead of a public execution, he was told he would be subjected to a new, humane form of capital punishment, where he would bleed to death without feeling pain. The inmate was blindfolded and restrained. A small incision was made on his skin, but it was shallow and harmless. Then, researchers played the sound of dripping liquid onto a metal tray, simulating the sound of his blood leaking out. The prisoner, believing he was actually bleeding to death, gradually became weaker, his breathing slowed, and eventually, he lost consciousness and died. In reality, he had not lost a significant amount of blood at all. His body simply shut down due to the overwhelming belief that he was dying. Other similar experiments have been rumored, where subjects were told they were being poisoned when they were actually given harmless injections, yet many displayed real symptoms of poisoning and even died, purely because their minds convinced their bodies that death was imminent. These findings reinforce the idea that psychological states can have profound physiological effects. Fear, stress, and belief can override biological survival mechanisms, leading to psychosomatic death, also known as voodoo death, a phenomenon where individuals die simply because they believe they have been cursed or fatally wounded. Though highly controversial, the auto-execution experiment serves as a terrifying demonstration of how powerful the mind is in shaping physical reality. It forces us to question how much of life, health, and even death is controlled not just by physical factors, but by perception and belief. The Dutton and Aron suspension bridge experiment. The Dutton and Aron suspension bridge experiment is one of the most fascinating psychological studies on how fear and adrenaline influence attraction. Conducted in 1974 by Donald Dutton and Arthur Aron, this experiment revealed that people are more likely to experience romantic attraction when their bodies are already in a state of physiological arousal, even if that arousal comes from fear. The researchers wanted to test a theory called misattribution of arousal, the idea that when people experience physical excitement or fear, their brains might mistakenly associate those feelings with romantic attraction rather than the true source of their adrenaline. To test this, they set up an experiment using two bridges in British Columbia, Canada. One was a high, shaky suspension bridge that swayed over a deep canyon. The other was a low, stable bridge that provided no sense of danger. At the center of each bridge, a female researcher stopped male participants as they crossed. She asked them to take part in a short study where they had to describe an ambiguous picture. After the task, she gave them her phone number, saying they could call her if they had any questions. The results were striking. The men who had crossed the high, unstable bridge were far more likely to call the woman afterward than those who had crossed the low, stable bridge. Even more interestingly, their descriptions of the picture contained significantly more sexual and romantic themes, suggesting that they were in a heightened emotional state. The researchers concluded that the adrenaline and excitement from crossing the high bridge tricked their brains into thinking they were more attracted to the woman than they actually were. Their fear and excitement were misinterpreted as romantic feelings. This experiment had profound implications for dating, attraction, and relationships. It suggests that when people experience something exciting, risky, or scary together, they are more likely to develop romantic feelings for each other, not necessarily because of true compatibility, but because their bodies are already in a state of heightened emotion. This concept has been used to explain why couples who meet during high-intensity situations, like thrill rides, horror movies, or extreme sports, often feel an intense attraction. The physical arousal from fear or excitement gets redirected into romantic attraction, creating a stronger bond than might have otherwise formed. The Dutton and Aron suspension bridge experiment remains one of the most well-known demonstrations of how our emotions are more influenced by our physical states than we realize. It forces us to question how often we mistake adrenaline for love, and whether the intensity of a situation can shape our feelings more than the person standing in front of us. The aversion therapy experiments. The aversion therapy experiments are some of the most controversial psychological studies ever conducted, based on the idea that unwanted behaviors can be cured by associating them with pain or discomfort. These experiments attempted to rewire the brain by creating negative associations, but they often resulted in severe psychological trauma, pain, and lasting emotional scars. Aversion therapy was based on classical conditioning, the same principle behind Pavlov's famous experiments with dogs. The idea was simple. If someone repeatedly experienced something unpleasant alongside a behavior, they would eventually learn to avoid that behavior altogether. One of the most infamous uses of aversion therapy was in the treatment of homosexuality, particularly during the 1950s to 1970s, when it was wrongly classified as a mental disorder. In these experiments, individuals were forced to watch same-sex erotic imagery while being subjected to electric shocks, nausea-inducing drugs, or other painful stimuli. The goal was to make them associate homosexuality with discomfort in hopes of curing them. Instead, it led to severe emotional distress, depression, and, in many cases, suicide. Aversion therapy was also used for addiction treatment. Alcoholics were given drugs like antabuse, disulfiram, which causes violent nausea and vomiting when combined with alcohol. The idea was to make drinking such a painful experience that they would be permanently discouraged. While this method showed some short-term success, many patients relapsed once the punishment was removed, proving that fear-based conditioning is often ineffective in the long run. Other aversion therapy experiments involved treating violent behavior or compulsions. Some psychiatric patients were given electroshock therapy while thinking about their impulses, with the hope that their desires would be eliminated. Others were subjected to sensory deprivation or forced isolation as punishment for acting out. The biggest problem with aversion therapy was that it treated symptoms rather than causes. It punished behaviors but never addressed why they existed in the first place. For many participants, it led to deep psychological trauma rather than meaningful change. By the late 20th century, aversion therapy was widely condemned as unethical and ineffective. Modern psychology recognizes that positive reinforcement and cognitive therapy are far more successful in creating long-term behavioral changes than pain and punishment. The aversion therapy experiments remain a dark chapter in psychological history, showing how the desire to control human behavior can lead to devastating consequences. They remind us that fear-based conditioning rarely leads to true transformation, only suffering. The Quiet Room Experiment. The Quiet Room Experiment is one of the most disturbing demonstrations of how extreme silence and isolation can break the human mind. It showed that when people are deprived of all noise, their brains begin to turn against them, creating sounds, hallucinations, and even paranoia where none exist. This experiment involved placing participants in a completely silent, soundproof chamber for extended periods. The room was designed to eliminate every possible noise, no outside sounds, no echoes, and no distractions. Even the participants' own movements were dampened, making them feel as if they were floating in absolute silence. At first, many participants described the experience as calming. They reported feeling peaceful and free from distractions. However, as the minutes turned into hours, things began to change. With no external sounds, the brain began amplifying internal noises. Participants could hear their own heartbeat, the movement of their muscles, and even the blood rushing through their veins. Some described hearing a constant ringing or buzzing, even though no such sound existed. For many, the experience quickly became overwhelming. With no external input, their brains started creating hallucinations to fill the void. Some saw flashing lights, others heard whispers or voices calling their names, even though they were completely alone. A few reported feeling as though someone else was in the room with them, despite knowing it was impossible. The longer they stayed in the room, the worse the effects became. Some participants became anxious and paranoid, convinced that something terrible was about to happen. Others felt a crushing sense of loneliness, describing the silence as suffocating and oppressive. In extreme cases, subjects began experiencing full-blown psychosis, losing track of time and questioning their own existence. Some lasted only a few minutes before begging to be let out, while others endured hours before breaking down completely. The Quiet Room Experiment had profound implications for understanding sensory deprivation, solitary confinement, and the effects of extreme silence on the brain. It helped explain why prisoners in solitary confinement often suffer severe psychological distress, and why isolation can be one of the most mentally damaging experiences a person can endure. Today, extreme soundproof chambers are sometimes used for meditation and deep focus, but only in short, controlled sessions. Any longer, and the experience can become terrifying. The quiet room experiment serves as a chilling reminder that humans are not meant to exist in absolute silence. Our brains are wired for stimulation, interaction, and external reality. When those are taken away, the mind creates its own reality, whether we like it or not. The Rape Role-Play Study. The Rape Role-Play Study is one of the most controversial psychological experiments ever conducted, exposing the disturbing complexities of human psychology when it comes to power, dominance, and sexual aggression. It sought to examine how individuals react to and interpret coercive sexual scenarios, but the ethical implications of the study were deeply troubling. Conducted in the 1970s, this study aimed to explore the psychological arousal and emotional responses to rape-related fantasies and role-play scenarios. Researchers wanted to understand whether fantasized or controlled scenarios of aggression could influence real-world attitudes toward sexual violence. Participants, both male and female, were asked to describe or imagine forced sexual encounters in controlled settings. Some were exposed to written scenarios, while others participated in role-play exercises, where they were assigned either the role of the aggressor or the victim. The goal was to analyze emotional responses, physiological arousal, and cognitive interpretations of the experience. The study produced highly controversial findings. Some participants, particularly men, reported increased arousal in response to scenarios involving dominance and coercion. For many, the power dynamics within the role play were more stimulating than the violent aspect itself. Women, in controlled environments, displayed a complex range of reactions, with some showing psychological distress, while others found aspects of the role play emotionally engaging within a consensual framework. However, the ethical violations of this study were enormous. The potential for psychological harm, re-traumatization, and reinforcement of harmful attitudes toward consent made the experiment highly unethical by today's standards. The study was widely condemned for blurring the lines between research and morally indefensible manipulation. One of the lasting implications of this research was the realization that sexual aggression in fantasies and controlled environments does not necessarily translate to real-world violent behavior. However, it also raised grave concerns about how exposure to such material might normalize coercion, reduce sensitivity toward victims, and even desensitize individuals to sexual violence. The Rape Role-Play Study remains one of the darkest and most ethically questionable psychological experiments ever conducted, proving that some areas of human psychology are too complex and too dangerous to be explored through direct experimentation. It forced psychologists to rethink how we study power, aggression, and human sexuality, while also highlighting the importance of consent, context, and ethical responsibility in psychological research. The Mouse Utopia Experiment. The Mouse Utopia Experiment is one of the most famous and disturbing studies on overpopulation, social collapse, and behavioral dysfunction. Conducted in the 1960s and 1970s by John B. Calhoun, this experiment was designed to explore what would happen if a population of mice was given unlimited resources, no predators, and perfect living conditions. What followed was a chilling demonstration of how abundance can lead to societal breakdown, despair, and eventual extinction. Calhoun built a mouse paradise, a giant, enclosed habitat with unlimited food, water, and nesting materials. There were no predators, no disease, and no environmental threats. It was a utopia where mice could live free from struggle. At first, the population grew rapidly. Mice flourished, reproduced, and expanded their society. Everything seemed perfect, but as the population continued to increase, strange behaviors began to emerge. Social structures began to break down. Male mice, who had once established clear territories and dominance hierarchies, became passive and withdrawn. Some stopped competing for mates altogether, while others became hyper-aggressive, attacking without cause. Female mice, overwhelmed by the overcrowding, became increasingly erratic. Many stopped caring for their young, abandoning or even cannibalizing their babies. Some refused to mate at all. As the social bonds within the community dissolved, chaos replaced order. A disturbing class of mice emerged, called the beautiful ones. These mice withdrew completely from social life. They spent all their time grooming themselves, refusing to mate, refusing to fight, and refusing to interact with the rest of the colony. They lived in total isolation, seemingly uninterested in the world around them. As these behavioral shifts became more pronounced, the birth rate plummeted. Despite having unlimited resources, the mice simply stopped reproducing. The population began to decline, then collapse completely. Eventually, every single mouse in the utopia died, not because of starvation, disease, or predation, but because their society had lost the will to function. Calhoun called this phenomenon behavioral sink, a state where society collapses, not due to external threats, but due to internal decay, caused by overpopulation and lack of meaningful social structures. He believed that this experiment mirrored human civilization, warning that if societies become too crowded, too easy, or too disconnected, they might suffer the same fate. The implications of the mouse utopia experiment were deeply unsettling. Some interpreted it as a warning about modern urbanization, suggesting that cities, where people are packed into dense environments with abundant resources, could eventually lead to similar social dysfunction, isolation, and a decline in birth rates. Others saw it as a study of existential despair, revealing that when all struggles are removed, a species may lose its sense of purpose and collapse from within. Despite its controversial interpretations, the mouse utopia experiment remains one of the most thought-provoking studies in psychology and sociology. It forces us to consider how much struggle, challenge, and purpose are necessary for a society to thrive, and whether a life of pure comfort and abundance might be more dangerous than we ever imagined. The LSD mind control tests. The LSD mind control tests are some of the most infamous psychological experiments in history, conducted as part of the CIA's secret MK Ultra project. These experiments sought to explore the potential of LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide, and other hallucinogenic drugs as tools for mind control, interrogation, and psychological warfare. What unfolded was a series of highly unethical, dangerous, and often terrifying experiments that ruined countless lives. During the 1950s and 1960s, the CIA believed that mind control could be the key to winning the Cold War. Inspired by reports that Soviet and Chinese forces were experimenting with brainwashing techniques, the U.S. government became obsessed with the idea of developing truth serums, memory manipulation, and mind control methods. The MK Ultra project, led by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, aimed to test whether LSD and other hallucinogens could make subjects more susceptible to suggestion, hypnosis, and reprogramming. The problem? These experiments were conducted without consent, often on unwitting participants. Many subjects were prisoners, mental patients, or military personnel, while others were random civilians who had no idea they were being drugged. Some of the worst cases involved dosing people with LSD over extended periods without their knowledge, leading to psychotic breaks, paranoia, and permanent mental damage. One of the most infamous victims of the program was Frank Olson, a scientist working for the U.S. Army. Without his knowledge, he was given a massive dose of LSD, which triggered a severe mental breakdown. 9 days later, he fell to his death from a hotel window, an event that many suspect was not suicide, but murder to silence him. The experiments also involved extreme psychological and physical torture. Some subjects were kept in sensory deprivation for weeks, while others were given drugs and subjected to electroshock therapy to erase their memories. The CIA even attempted to create hypnotized assassins, programming individuals to carry out missions with no memory of their actions. The LSD mind control tests were eventually exposed in the 1970s, leading to outrage, lawsuits, and congressional hearings. However, many of the documents had already been destroyed, and the full extent of the experiments remains unknown. The legacy of these experiments is chilling. They proved that governments are willing to violate basic human rights in the pursuit of power. They also raised questions about how much of human behavior can truly be controlled, and whether the darkest secrets of MKUltra have ever really been brought to light. The false confession experiment. The false confession experiment is one of the most unsettling demonstrations of how easily people can be manipulated into confessing to crimes they didn't commit. Conducted by Saul Kassin and Catherine Keichel in 1996, this study revealed that even innocent individuals, under the right psychological pressure, can be made to believe they are guilty. The experiment aimed to simulate the conditions of a real-life police interrogation and test whether innocent people could be convinced they had committed an offense they never actually committed. Participants were brought into a lab and asked to complete a simple typing task. They were explicitly warned not to hit a certain key on the keyboard, as doing so would supposedly crash the computer system. The participants then began typing while the researchers subtly manipulated the situation to create confusion. At some point, the computer was intentionally shut down, and the researchers falsely accused the participants of causing the crash by pressing the forbidden key. The participants were then subjected to different levels of psychological pressure. Some were confronted aggressively, while others were coaxed into admitting guilt through suggestive questioning. To further push them, the researchers introduced false evidence, saying that another person had seen them press the key, even though no such witness existed. Shockingly, a significant number of participants admitted to pressing the key, even though they knew they hadn't. Some even began genuinely believing that they must have done it, despite clear memories that contradicted the accusation. The experiment showed that memory is incredibly malleable, and under enough pressure, people can be led to question their own reality. This had devastating implications for police interrogations and wrongful convictions. Real-world cases of false confessions have led to innocent people being imprisoned for years, or even sentenced to death, for crimes they never committed. This study demonstrated that coercion, leading questions, and psychological pressure can break even the strongest individuals, making them confess to things that never happened. The false confession experiment forced the legal system to rethink interrogation tactics. It exposed the dangers of forcing suspects to endure long, aggressive questioning, where fear, exhaustion, and suggestion can override logic and memory. Today, psychologists and legal experts continue to warn about the risks of false confessions, arguing that modern interrogation techniques still rely on psychological manipulation. This study remains a haunting reminder that, under the right circumstances, anyone, no matter how innocent, can be made to believe in their own guilt. The psychic driving experiment. The psychic driving experiment is one of the most horrifying psychological studies ever conducted, involving extreme mind control techniques that resulted in permanent psychological damage. Led by Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron in the 1950s and 1960s, this experiment aimed to erase and reprogram the human mind, but instead, it left victims with shattered identities, erased memories, and lifelong trauma. Cameron was a renowned psychiatrist working under Project MKUltra, the CIA's infamous secret program dedicated to mind control research. He believed that by breaking down a person's existing thoughts and identity, he could then implant new beliefs and behaviors, essentially reprogramming human beings like machines. His method, known as psychic driving, involved subjecting patients to relentless audio recordings played on loop for days, weeks, or even months. Patients, many of whom were seeking treatment for minor mental health issues like anxiety or postpartum depression, were placed in a drugged, immobilized state and forced to listen to repetitive messages. These messages included statements such as, "You are a failure," "You need to obey," and "Your mother hated you." They were played thousands of times while patients were kept in a vegetative state with the help of powerful drugs, including LSD, barbiturates, and paralytics. Some patients were also subjected to electroshock therapy at 30 to 40 times the normal intensity, wiping out their long-term memories. By the time they were released, many had forgotten who they were, lost their ability to function normally, or even lost their capacity for speech. Some were reduced to a childlike state, while others were left permanently institutionalized. Families were shattered as loved ones emerged from treatment unrecognizable and unable to recall their past lives. The experiment was later exposed as one of the most grotesque abuses of psychiatric power in history. The Canadian government and the CIA both faced legal consequences, and Cameron's work was widely condemned as inhumane and unethical. The psychic driving experiment remains one of the darkest reminders of what happens when science is weaponized against the human mind. It showed that the brain can be broken down and reprogrammed, but at a terrible cost. The infant deprivation experiment. The infant deprivation experiment is one of the most heartbreaking psychological studies ever conducted, proving that love and human connection are just as essential for survival as food and water. This experiment, dating back to the 13th century and later replicated in modern psychology, showed that without affection, infants do not just suffer emotionally, they can die from lack of human touch alone. The first known case of such an experiment was carried out by Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II in the 1200s. Frederick wanted to discover what language babies would naturally develop if they were never spoken to. To test this, he ordered that a group of infants be raised in total silence, no talking, no touching, and no affection from caregivers. The result was horrifying. Every single infant died. Even though they were fed, bathed, and physically cared for, the complete lack of human interaction and affection caused them to waste away. Centuries later, modern psychology unintentionally confirmed these findings. In the 1940s, Dr. René Spitz studied orphaned infants in overcrowded institutions, where babies were given minimal human contact. Unlike babies raised in normal homes, these children suffered from severe developmental delays, emotional withdrawal, and physical deterioration. Many simply stopped responding to the world. Some infants developed marasmus, a condition where the body physically wastes away due to extreme emotional neglect. Even when given proper food and medical care, they still failed to thrive. More than a third of these children died before their first birthday. This research had massive implications for childcare and psychology. It proved that love, touch, and human connection are not luxuries. They are fundamental to survival. The findings helped reform orphanage care, hospital nurseries, and early childhood psychology, ensuring that infants in institutional settings were given regular human interaction. The infant deprivation experiment remains one of the most tragic demonstrations of the importance of love and connection. It revealed that without emotional warmth, the human body and mind cannot flourish and, in extreme cases, may not survive at all. The shocked rats experiment. The shocked rats experiment is one of the most unsettling demonstrations of how stress, trauma, and fear responses can be deeply embedded into an organism's behavior. Conducted by researchers in the mid-20th century, this experiment sought to examine how animals react to unpredictable punishment and whether those reactions can be permanently ingrained in their psychology. The results provided critical insights into learned helplessness, anxiety disorders, and the long-term effects of trauma. In the experiment, rats were placed in cages with an electrified floor. They were subjected to random, unavoidable electric shocks that they could not escape or predict. Initially, the rats reacted with typical escape behaviors, running around frantically, trying to climb the walls, or searching for a way out. But as the shocks continued, something alarming happened. The rats stopped trying to escape altogether. They froze in place, curled up, and simply accepted the pain, showing no effort to avoid the shocks, even when the cage door was left open. This phenomenon was later coined as learned helplessness, the idea that when a subject is repeatedly exposed to a painful or stressful situation that they cannot control, they eventually stop trying to escape, even when opportunities for freedom arise. The implications were profound, especially for understanding human behavior. Learned helplessness was later observed in abuse victims, prisoners, and individuals with depression who, after experiencing repeated emotional or physical distress, ceased to resist their suffering and lost the motivation to improve their situation. The study explained why some people remain in toxic relationships, abusive environments, or hopeless conditions, not because they are weak, but because their brains have been conditioned to believe that escape is impossible. The shocked rats experiment also raised concerns about how unpredictable stress affects brain function, leading to chronic anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The study helped pave the way for research into cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and other psychological interventions designed to break the cycle of helplessness by teaching individuals that they do, in fact, have control over their circumstances. Though ethically troubling, the experiment revealed the dark reality of how sustained psychological distress can completely rewire behavior, stripping individuals of their ability to fight back, even when freedom is within reach. It remains a chilling reminder that the greatest form of psychological control is convincing someone that they have none at all. The fear conditioning experiment. The fear conditioning experiment is one of the most famous studies in behavioral psychology, demonstrating how fear can be artificially implanted into the brain through association. Conducted by John B. Watson and Rosalie Rayner in 1920, this experiment provided groundbreaking insight into how phobias are created, but it also remains one of the most ethically controversial studies ever conducted. The experiment was conducted on an infant known as Little Albert, who was around 9 months old at the time. Watson and Rayner wanted to prove that fear is not always instinctual, but can be learned through experience. To test this, they exposed Little Albert to a white rat, a harmless, fluffy animal. At first, the baby showed no fear and played with the rat happily. However, Watson then introduced a loud, startling noise by striking a metal bar behind Albert's head every time he reached for the rat. The noise frightened the child, making him cry. This process was repeated multiple times until little Albert began associating the sight of the rat with fear. Soon, he didn't need the loud noise to become terrified. Just seeing the rat alone was enough to make him cry and recoil in fear. The conditioning did not stop there. Watson wanted to see if this fear would generalize to other objects. He introduced other fluffy or white things, rabbits, dogs, even a Santa Claus mask with white fur. To his horror, little Albert became frightened of all of them, proving that a single traumatic association could spread beyond its original source, creating a broader phobia. The experiment revealed that fear is not always innate. It can be implanted through association. This discovery became the foundation for behavioral therapy techniques, particularly exposure therapy, which helps people unlearn irrational fears by gradually reintroducing them to feared stimuli in a controlled environment. Despite its scientific importance, the experiment remains one of the most unethical in psychology's history. Watson and Rayner never attempted to undo the fear they instilled in little Albert, meaning the child was left permanently affected by an artificially created phobia. There are also mysteries surrounding what happened to little Albert later in life, with some reports suggesting he lived with a lifelong fear of animals due to the experiment. The fear conditioning experiment exposed the terrifying ease with which human emotions can be manipulated. It showed that fear is not always rational, but something that can be programmed into the brain like a computer virus, making it one of the most disturbing studies in the history of psychology. The remote-controlled rats experiment. The remote-controlled rats experiment is one of the most unsettling studies in neuroscience, proving that animal behavior and potentially human behavior can be controlled through brain stimulation. Conducted in the early 2000s by Dr. John Chapin and his team, this experiment demonstrated that rats could be steered like living robots using wireless electrodes implanted in their brains. The implications were both fascinating and deeply disturbing, raising questions about the possibility of remote mind control in higher animals, including humans. Chapin's team surgically implanted electrodes into the somatosensory cortex and medial forebrain bundle of lab rats, areas of the brain responsible for movement and reward processing. The electrodes were wirelessly connected to a computer, allowing researchers to send electrical pulses to specific brain regions. The experiment was simple but shocking. When a rat was placed in an open environment, the researchers stimulated the left or right part of its brain, causing it to turn in that direction as if it had made the decision itself. To reinforce the behavior, they stimulated the reward center immediately after the rat followed a command, creating the illusion that the rat was choosing to obey, when, in reality, it was being manipulated at a neurological level. These rats, dubbed roborats, could be guided through complex obstacle courses, climb walls, and even navigate disaster zones, all without any independent decision-making. The most disturbing part was that they still believed they were acting on their own free will, when in reality, their brains were being remotely controlled like a video game character. The experiment had profound implications for search and rescue missions, military applications, and even neuroscience research. Scientists proposed using remote-controlled rats to locate earthquake survivors, detect bombs, or explore dangerous environments where humans could not go. However, ethical concerns arose immediately. The idea of using similar technology on humans became a terrifying possibility. If a rat could be tricked into thinking it was making its own decisions while actually being controlled, what would stop the same technology from being applied to people? This led to debates about the ethics of brain-machine interfaces, free will, and the potential for misuse in warfare or law enforcement. The remote-controlled rats experiment remains one of the most unnerving demonstrations of how the mind can be hijacked without the subject even realizing it. It forces us to ask difficult questions about the future of neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and the ethical limits of controlling biological organisms. The authority bias experiment. The authority bias experiment is one of the most unsettling psychological studies on how people blindly follow orders from perceived authority figures, even when those orders are morally wrong. Conducted by Stanley Milgram in 1961, this experiment revealed that ordinary people are capable of committing acts of cruelty, not because they are inherently evil, but because they feel pressured to obey authority. Milgram designed his experiment to test whether people would obey orders to harm another person if commanded by an authority figure. Inspired by the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi officials defended their actions by claiming they were just following orders, Milgram wanted to determine whether anyone, under the right circumstances, could become complicit in harming others. Participants were told they were part of a study on learning and memory. They were instructed to administer electric shocks to another person, an actor pretending to be a fellow participant. Each time the learner gave a wrong answer, The shock started at low levels, but with each mistake, the voltage was increased. Unbeknownst to the participant, there were no actual shocks. The actor was simply pretending to be in pain. As the shocks escalated, the actor begged for mercy, screamed in pain, and eventually fell silent, implying unconsciousness or death. Despite this, when participants hesitated, the authority figure, a researcher in a white lab coat, simply urged them to continue, using phrases like, "The experiment requires that you continue," or "You have no choice but to proceed." The results were terrifying. 65% of participants administered what they believed to be the maximum lethal voltage. Even when they showed signs of distress, sweating, trembling, and arguing, they continued the experiment simply because they were told to do so. Milgram's findings shocked the world, proving that blind obedience to authority can override moral judgment. It explained how individuals in hierarchical systems, such as soldiers, police officers, or corporate employees, might commit atrocities simply because they are following orders. The authority bias experiment had massive implications for ethics, law, and social psychology. It provided insight into how authoritarian regimes manipulate people into compliance, why corporate whistleblowers are so rare, and how peer pressure from authority figures influences behavior. Today, the experiment serves as a chilling reminder that human morality is more fragile than we like to believe. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Most people, given the right circumstances, are capable of terrible things, not because they are evil, but because they are obedient. The strain of secrecy experiment. The strain of secrecy experiment is one of the most unsettling studies on the psychological burden of keeping secrets and how it affects human behavior, stress levels, and even physical health. Conducted by researchers in social psychology and neuroscience, this experiment demonstrated that carrying a secret, especially a significant one, creates real, measurable stress on the brain and body. The study sought to examine how harboring a secret, particularly one involving guilt or deception, influences mental and emotional well-being. Participants were placed in two groups. One group was asked to confess a deeply personal secret to a researcher in confidence, while the other was instructed to keep their secret entirely to themselves for the duration of the study. Over time, researchers observed significant differences between the two groups. The individuals who kept their secrets exhibited higher levels of stress hormones like cortisol, experienced more intrusive thoughts, and reported higher levels of anxiety, fatigue, and even physical symptoms such as headaches and muscle tension. Their minds obsessively returned to the secret, creating a psychological loop where they constantly rehearsed what they knew but could not share. In contrast, those who had confessed their secrets, even to a neutral observer, showed lower physiological stress responses and reported a sense of relief, even if the confession had no real-world consequences. This suggested that simply verbalizing or writing down a secret, rather than suppressing it, could reduce its psychological burden. Further studies revealed that keeping secrets alters cognitive function and decision-making, leading to increased mental fatigue and reduced willpower. The strain of constantly monitoring what one can and cannot say in social situations drains mental energy, making individuals more prone to mistakes, poor judgment, and social withdrawal. This experiment also had profound implications for people in high-security jobs, relationships, and trauma survivors, demonstrating that keeping secrets, especially distressing ones, can lead to long-term mental health issues such as anxiety, depression, and even chronic illness. The strain of secrecy experiment provided scientific validation for an age-old truth. Secrets weigh on the soul. It proved that harboring hidden thoughts is not just an emotional burden, but a biological one, reinforcing why people often feel an instinctive urge to confess, even when doing so comes at great risk. The hollow mask experiment. The hollow mask experiment is one of the most fascinating studies on how the brain distorts reality, proving that our perception of the world is not always accurate. It revealed that the human brain is wired to see what it expects rather than what is actually there, a phenomenon that has profound implications for psychology, neuroscience, and even schizophrenia research. The experiment involved showing participants a hollow, concave mask of a human face, with the inside of the mask facing them. Logically, the mask should appear sunken inward, as it is physically hollow. However, most people perceive it as a normal, convex face sticking outward, as if it were a regular, three-dimensional face. This optical illusion occurs because the human brain automatically corrects what it sees based on past experience. The brain is so accustomed to seeing human faces protrude outward that it overrides the actual visual information and forces the illusion of depth onto the hollow mask. The most astonishing discovery came when researchers tested patients with schizophrenia. Unlike neurotypical individuals, schizophrenic patients were less likely to be fooled by the illusion. Their brains processed the mask more objectively, accurately recognizing that it was concave rather than convex. This finding suggested that people with schizophrenia experience reality differently, processing visual stimuli in a rawer, less assumption-driven way. The hollow mask experiment provided incredible insight into how the brain prioritizes patterns, expectations, and past experiences over actual sensory data. It revealed that perception is not simply a direct reflection of reality, it is a reconstruction based on assumptions. Beyond its implications for schizophrenia, the experiment also reinforced the idea that our brains lie to us all the time. From optical illusions to cognitive biases, memory distortions, and false beliefs, the brain constantly reshapes reality to fit its own expectations. The hollow mask experiment serves as a powerful reminder that what we see is not always what is real. It forces us to question not only our visual perception, but also the way we interpret the world around us, proving that reality is often just a product of our brain's best guess. The fake asylum commitment experiment. The fake asylum commitment experiment is one of the most shocking demonstrations of how easily psychiatric institutions can misdiagnose and mistreat individuals, raising critical concerns about the validity of mental health assessments. Conducted in 1973 by psychologist David Rosenhan, this experiment proved that once someone is labeled as mentally ill, it is nearly impossible to shake the label, no matter how sane they actually are. Rosenhan and 7 other completely sane individuals volunteered to get themselves committed to psychiatric hospitals under false pretenses. Each of them told doctors the same fabricated symptom. They heard voices saying, empty, hollow, and thud. Other than this, they behaved completely normally and had no history of mental illness. Shockingly, every single one of them was diagnosed with schizophrenia or another severe disorder and immediately institutionalized. Once inside, they acted completely sane, yet none of the doctors or hospital staff suspected the deception. They spoke normally, cooperated with all procedures, and even openly told staff that they felt fine and had no symptoms. Despite their obvious normal behavior, hospital staff interpreted everything they did as evidence of mental illness. If they took notes on their observations, it was recorded as engaging in compulsive writing. If they politely asked when they could leave, it was noted as exhibiting anxiety. On average, they were forced to stay for 19 days, with some trapped inside for nearly 2 months, all while being heavily medicated. Perhaps the most chilling part of the experiment was that other patients, actual psychiatric patients, could tell the pseudo-patients were sane, yet the doctors could not. Many real patients would say things like, "You're not crazy, are you? You're a journalist or something?" After the study was published, exposing how unreliable psychiatric diagnoses could be, one hospital challenged Rosenhan, claiming their staff would never fall for such a deception. They invited him to send more fake patients, promising they would detect them. Over the next several months, the hospital proudly identified 41 suspected pseudo-patients. But in reality, Rosenhan had sent no one at all. The fake asylum commitment experiment led to massive reforms in mental health care, forcing institutions to rethink how they diagnose and treat patients. It remains a terrifying reminder that once you are labeled as mentally ill, everything you do can be seen as proof of your insanity, even if you are completely sane. The Extreme Social Isolation Experiment. The Extreme Social Isolation Experiment is one of the most disturbing psychological studies ever conducted, proving that humans are not designed to live without social contact. This experiment revealed that long-term isolation can cause severe mental and physical deterioration, leading to psychosis, hallucinations, and even death. One of the most well-documented cases of extreme social isolation involved Donald Hebb's sensory deprivation experiments in the 1950s. In these studies, volunteers were placed in soundproof, light-proof rooms, completely cut off from human contact and sensory stimulation. They wore thick goggles, padded gloves, and sound-canceling earmuffs, ensuring they had zero external interaction. At first, participants were bored but calm, describing the experience as peaceful. But after a few hours, things started to change drastically. With no external stimuli to keep their brains engaged, their minds began creating their own realities. Many started hallucinating vividly, seeing ghostly shapes, flashing lights, or even entire dream-like scenarios. Some heard whispers or strange voices, despite the complete silence. As the hours stretched into days, cognitive function began to break down. Participants lost their ability to concentrate, form coherent thoughts, and even distinguish between past and present. Time lost all meaning, with some believing only minutes had passed when hours had gone by. Others felt trapped in an eternal nightmare, convinced they had been abandoned for weeks, despite only being isolated for a short period. Many suffered emotional breakdowns, becoming paranoid and anxious, convinced that something terrible was about to happen. Some even began talking to themselves or engaging in compulsive, repetitive behaviors, such as rocking back and forth or muttering nonsensical phrases. The experiment had to be cut short for many participants, as their psychological distress became too severe. Some were never the same again, experiencing lingering paranoia, anxiety, and even PTSD-like symptoms long after the experiment ended. This research had profound implications for understanding the effects of solitary confinement in prisons, extreme isolation in space travel, and the importance of social interaction for mental health. It explained why prisoners in solitary confinement often suffer mental breakdowns, why hostages and long-term castaways develop psychological scars, and why humans instinctively crave social connection, even in small doses. The Extreme Social Isolation Experiment remains a haunting demonstration of how the human mind is wired for interaction. It forces us to acknowledge that loneliness is more than just an emotion. It is a psychological and physiological threat to survival. The Perception-Altering Drug Experiments. The perception-altering drug experiments are some of the most disturbing studies in psychological history, proving that human perception can be chemically manipulated to the point where reality itself becomes unrecognizable. Conducted during the mid-20th century, particularly under CIA projects like MKUltra, these experiments sought to explore how psychedelic substances, hallucinogens, and mind-altering chemicals could influence thought, perception, and behavior, often with devastating consequences. One of the most infamous perception-altering drug studies involved the unwitting administration of LSD to military personnel, prisoners, and even civilians. The idea was to test whether hallucinogens could be used to manipulate individuals, extract confessions, or break enemy soldiers mentally. In some cases, participants were given high doses of LSD without being told, leading to terrifying psychological episodes, complete breakdowns of reality, and in some cases, permanent psychosis. Participants in these experiments reported losing all sense of time and space, seeing vivid hallucinations, hearing voices, and experiencing terrifying visions. Some believed they were dead or trapped in alternate realities, while others forgot who they were entirely. Scientists documented how LSD could induce intense paranoia, delusions of grandeur, and in some cases, uncontrollable aggression. A particularly chilling case involved a CIA scientist named Frank Olson, who was unknowingly dosed with LSD and later suffered a complete psychological collapse. Within days, he fell to his death from a hotel window, an event that remains shrouded in mystery. Many believe he was murdered to silence him. The perception-altering drug experiments also included the use of sensory deprivation combined with hallucinogens, where participants were kept in dark, silent rooms while under the influence of LSD or other substances. Many descended into madness, reporting disembodied voices, shadowy figures, and even out-of-body experiences. The long-term effects were often devastating, with subjects developing schizophrenia-like symptoms, memory loss, and severe depression. These experiments exposed the horrifying extent to which governments and scientific institutions were willing to manipulate human minds in pursuit of power. They proved that perception is fragile and can be chemically hijacked, forcing us to question how much of what we see, hear, and believe is truly real. The Forced Interrogation Experiment. The forced interrogation experiment is one of the most ethically horrifying psychological studies ever conducted, revealing the extreme psychological and physiological effects of torture, coercion, and relentless interrogation tactics. These experiments, often carried out in military and intelligence settings, sought to determine how long a person could resist pressure before breaking psychologically, with results that were deeply disturbing. One of the most infamous forced interrogation studies took place during Cold War-era research programs designed to test how prisoners of war could be manipulated into confessing to crimes, providing false information, or betraying their allegiances. In these experiments, subjects were subjected to sleep deprivation, extreme temperatures, starvation, and prolonged psychological stress while being repeatedly interrogated. One common method involved keeping participants awake for days on end, using bright lights, blaring sounds, and forced physical activity to prevent them from sleeping. After just 48 hours, subjects began to experience hallucinations, paranoia, and severe mood swings. By 72 hours, many became incoherent, breaking down into sobs, begging for mercy, or becoming delusional. Another technique, known as stress positioning, forced individuals to stand in unnatural postures for hours at a time, causing excruciating pain and mental exhaustion. The goal was to weaken their ability to resist interrogation, making them more likely to say whatever their captors wanted to hear, even if it was false. Researchers also experimented with mock executions, where participants were made to believe they were about to be killed. Some were blindfolded and forced to listen to the sound of a gun being cocked, while others were led to the edge of high platforms and told they were about to be pushed off. The psychological trauma was so severe that many developed long-term PTSD, emotional numbness, and permanent distrust toward authority figures. One of the most terrifying revelations of the forced interrogation experiment was that coerced confessions were often completely unreliable. Many subjects, after enough psychological torture, confessed to crimes they never committed, fabricated details to appease their interrogators, or even started to believe false memories implanted by their captors. The findings from these studies had lasting consequences. While they proved that intense psychological pressure could break nearly anyone, they also revealed that information obtained through torture is often inaccurate and unreliable. Despite this, coercive interrogation tactics continue to be used in intelligence operations worldwide, raising serious ethical concerns about the treatment of detainees. The forced interrogation experiment serves as a chilling reminder that under enough pressure, the human mind is not unbreakable. It can be bent, twisted, and even made to betray itself. It forces us to confront the terrifying reality that mental resilience has limits and no one is truly immune to psychological manipulation. The blinding light experiment. The blinding light experiment is one of the most extreme demonstrations of sensory overload and its effects on human perception and cognition. This psychological study sought to determine how continuous exposure to bright, overwhelming light could alter the brain, induce confusion, and break down a person's sense of time, space, and even identity. Researchers placed participants in small, windowless rooms flooded with intense, unrelenting artificial light for extended periods. The lighting was so bright that it eliminated all shadows, removing depth perception and making it impossible for participants to orient themselves. The goal was to see how the human mind copes when deprived of normal light-dark cycles and subjected to continuous sensory stimulation. At first, subjects reported mild discomfort and eye strain, but as the hours stretched into days, their experiences became more disturbing. Many lost their ability to track time, unable to tell whether minutes or hours had passed. Their sleep cycles were completely disrupted, with some developing insomnia, severe fatigue, and even hallucinations. Participants described feeling like they were floating in a void, unable to distinguish objects from one another. Some began experiencing visual distortions, seeing shapes, movement, and colors that did not exist. A few even saw shadowy figures moving in the blinding brightness, an eerie demonstration of how the brain compensates when deprived of normal sensory input. The effects on mood were equally extreme. Many participants became irritable, paranoid, and emotionally unstable. Some described feeling as if their minds were unraveling, reporting intense anxiety, mood swings, and overwhelming feelings of despair. Even after leaving the experiment, some suffered lingering effects, such as sensitivity to light, nightmares, and difficulty adjusting to normal environments. The blinding light experiment had profound implications for interrogation techniques, sensory overload studies, and space travel research. It revealed that prolonged exposure to an unnatural, high-stimulation environment can deeply damage the brain's ability to process reality. It also raised ethical concerns, particularly about how extreme lighting conditions are used in sleep deprivation and psychological warfare to break prisoners' resistance. This experiment serves as a haunting reminder that too much sensory stimulation can be just as damaging as total deprivation, proving that when the mind is overwhelmed, it begins to disintegrate in terrifying ways. The forced cooperation experiment. The forced cooperation experiment is one of the most unsettling studies on how pressure, coercion, and manipulation can override human free will, revealing the disturbing ease with which people can be compelled to act against their personal values and instincts. This experiment exposed the deep psychological mechanisms behind peer pressure, obedience, and forced collaboration in high-stress situations. Participants were placed in a controlled environment and paired with another individual whom they were led to believe was a fellow participant but was actually a researcher or actor. They were given a set of tasks, some simple and harmless, but others ethically questionable or morally uncomfortable. The catch was that one participant was forced to cooperate, even when they strongly resisted or objected. The experimenters used a variety of psychological techniques to break down resistance and enforce compliance. Some subjects were made to believe that refusing to cooperate would lead to punishment, ostracization, or harm to their partner. Others were offered false praise, manipulated into believing their actions were for the greater good. As the tasks escalated, many participants reluctantly complied, even when they were asked to perform morally disturbing actions, such as lying, inflicting discomfort, or making decisions that they knew would negatively affect others. Some attempted to resist, but under continued pressure, nearly all of them eventually submitted. One of the most chilling findings was that many participants, after being forced to comply multiple times, began justifying their own actions, convincing themselves that their choices were necessary or even beneficial. This revealed a powerful psychological process known as cognitive dissonance, where people change their beliefs to align with their actions in order to avoid inner conflict. The experiment provided crucial insight into how forced cooperation is used in authoritarian regimes, military settings, and even corporate or social structures to make individuals follow orders against their better judgment. It explained why people in oppressive environments often go along with unethical decisions, not necessarily because they agree, but because they feel they have no other choice. The forced cooperation experiment is a haunting example of how easily people can be manipulated into submission, proving that free will is often an illusion when social and psychological pressures are strong enough. It forces us to ask a terrifying question: if placed in the right conditions, would any of us be capable of doing things we once thought unimaginable? The Groupthink Disaster Experiment. The Groupthink Disaster Experiment is one of the most disturbing studies in social psychology, proving that people will often abandon their own critical thinking and moral judgment in favor of maintaining group harmony, even when disastrous consequences are at stake. This experiment demonstrated how peer pressure, authority, and fear of dissent can lead to catastrophic decision-making, explaining why governments, corporations, and entire societies sometimes make irrational, destructive choices. Researchers gathered groups of participants and assigned them a high-stakes decision-making scenario, such as handling a corporate crisis, responding to a fictional military threat, or deciding how to allocate limited resources in an emergency. Unbeknownst to them, the experiment was designed to introduce pressures that encouraged conformity over independent thinking. Within each group, a leader or dominant figure was strategically placed, an actor or researcher posing as a participant, who subtly steered the conversation toward a particular decision, often an obviously flawed or risky one. Other actors were also embedded within the groups to support the bad idea and create an illusion of agreement. As discussions progressed, researchers observed how group members suppressed their doubts, ignored alternative viewpoints, and prioritized unity over logic. Some participants clearly recognized the flaws in the plan, but rather than voicing concerns or challenging the majority, they chose to stay silent to avoid conflict, ridicule, or exclusion. Others, even when uncomfortable, began convincing themselves that the group must be right, abandoning their initial objections. Shockingly, in nearly every trial, the group reached a dangerous or impractical decision despite clear warning signs. Even participants who hesitated early on became active supporters of the flawed plan, simply because they did not want to stand out as dissenters. This experiment replicated real-world patterns seen in corporate failures, government scandals, military blunders, and financial crashes. It explained why executives ignore warning signs of a failing business model, why countries engage in disastrous wars despite obvious red flags, and why entire societies have blindly followed harmful policies. The study confirmed that the fear of disrupting social harmony is often more powerful than logic, ethics, or even self-preservation. It served as a warning that when too much emphasis is placed on agreement and avoiding dissent, even intelligent, well-meaning individuals can make irrational, catastrophic choices. The groupthink disaster experiment forces us to question how often we too might ignore our better judgment simply to avoid going against the majority. It serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous thing a person can do is stay silent when they know something is wrong. The face-morphing self-perception experiment. The face-morphing self-perception experiment is one of the most unsettling studies on identity, self-image, and how the brain distorts reality. This experiment proved that our perception of ourselves is not based on objective reality, but on subconscious biases, social conditioning, and hidden insecurities. Researchers took high-resolution photos of participants and, without their knowledge, digitally altered their faces to create two versions, one that was slightly more attractive and another that was slightly less attractive. Participants were then shown a range of photos, including their real face, the enhanced version, and the distorted version, and were asked to pick which one they believed was their actual face. The results were disturbing. Many participants failed to recognize their real face, instead choosing either the enhanced or less attractive version based on their self-esteem and subconscious self-image. People who had high confidence were far more likely to pick the improved version, believing themselves to look more attractive than they actually were. Meanwhile, those with low self-esteem frequently chose the less attractive image, convinced that their real face was more flawed than it actually was. The experiment exposed how our self-perception is rarely accurate. Instead of seeing ourselves as we truly are, we are influenced by emotions, past experiences, and societal standards of beauty. It explained why some people feel unattractive despite being objectively good-looking, while others carry themselves with confidence even when their appearance hasn't changed. One of the most unsettling findings was that participants who suffered from body dysmorphia or deep-seated insecurities struggled to recognize their actual face at all. Some outright rejected their true image, unable to believe that their real face was neutral or attractive. Their brains had reshaped their perception so dramatically that they could not see themselves as they truly were. This experiment had profound implications for mental health, self-esteem, and media influence. It proved that our perception of beauty is not fixed. It is flexible, distorted, and often completely detached from reality. It also revealed how constant exposure to idealized beauty standards in media can warp our self-image, making people believe they are less attractive than they actually are. The face-morphing self-perception experiment forces us to confront an unsettling truth. The way we see ourselves may have little to do with how we actually look. It raises deep questions about how much of our identity is shaped by our own minds, and how often our minds lie to us about who we really are.